I never thought my family's will would unravel like a cheap piece of yarn, but here we are, sitting at our cramped kitchen table under the flickering light bulb that's a bit too yellow, discussing the accusations that have turned my whole world upside down. My brothers and I grew up idolizing our two uncles, who were the quintessential cool relatives, full of jokes, stories about their time in the military, and life lessons that felt like gold on summer afternoons. Our family gatherings often felt like a circus, laughter, potluck dishes that were barely edible, and the feeling that we were connected by something unbreakable, woven tight through years of shared experiences. But as my parents aged, the family dynamics began to shift in unsettling ways. The whispers started when my parents, both long retired and now comfortably settled in a quiet life, began discussing their estate plan. It had never been something I paid much attention to until my dad casually mentioned to me one evening while we were cleaning up after dinner that he and my mom had decided not to leave any significant inheritance to our uncles, which was a shock to hear. "We worked hard for what we have," he said, and I could tell he was a little offended that his brothers would presume otherwise. It made sense, right? After all, our family's financial struggles back in the day were no secret, and to think they might expect something now felt like a betrayal. But who was I to carry this burden? Then came the day it all changed. The kitchen remained silent, the kind of silent that presses heavily against your chest, until my older brother, Jason, unexpectedly burst in with the kind of energy reserved for someone who has just discovered the cure for a long-standing disease. He proclaimed he had heard from one of his friends about my Uncle Mark planning a family reunion and was hellbent on incorporating discussions about inheritance into the festivities. It felt crass to me, the idea of talking about money amongst all the laughter and nostalgic reminiscing, but it was as if I were in a play where I could either choose to speak my lines or just freeze on stage, utterly paralyzed by the impending drama. In my heart, I knew I should tell them, but the thought of being the one to drop that bomb was unbearable. Days passed, each one heavier than the last, while I kept my secret, debating whether to alert my uncles or to let them assume that something profound would come their way. The thought of my father's words rang in my mind, "Don't let them think they can take what's ours," and part of me held onto that sentiment with a grip stronger than iron. I started to feel guilty, especially when I noticed how quiet the uncles were whenever they visited. The usual banter gave way to awkward pauses as they sidled up to the kitchen counter, waiting for a slice of my mom's famous apple pie and, perhaps, a hint of what was to come. One afternoon, I couldn't take it any longer. I texted my uncles to meet with me for coffee, hoping against hope that I could muster the courage to be straightforward, to be the one to break the news gently, perhaps even offering them some semblance of understanding. They showed up on a Tuesday morning, both eager and slightly skeptical. The cafe was quaint, light flooded through the large windows, and as soon as we sat down, I found myself staring at the cup of steaming coffee in front of me, their expectant eyes glancing between me and the pastry display. My mouth felt dry when I finally spoke, the words catching like thorns in my throat, unsure how to wrap them in kindness. I told them about my parents' decision, watched their faces shift from curiosity to disbelief, and then dismay. Mark, in particular, looked wounded, like I'd trampled on something sacred. "We've always been family," he said, his voice a mix of hurt and disappointment. How could they do this to us? I felt every inch of that guilt stab deep. The conversation spiraled, and by the time we parted, my heart was heavy with regret and concern. Days turned into weeks as the awkwardness settled like dust in the corners of our once bustling family gatherings. Neither my uncles nor I could bridge the emotional chasm that had suddenly appeared. Each time they visited, they'd hug me but linger a second longer as if waiting for an apology or some clarification that I just couldn't offer. My brothers and I spoke often about the rift, our conversations tinged with uncertainty about whether we'd created an irreparable divide between our family factions. Soon, my parents caught wind of the tension, and I knew they felt the strain, their content lives now shadowed by the repercussions of their decision. Finally, after a particularly strained holiday dinner, I sat down with my parents and laid everything out, the tension, the questions from my uncles, and how much it pained me to face them each time without a resolution. To my surprise, they listened quietly, expressions unreadable. After a long pause, my father finally sighed, "Maybe we should talk to them, clear the air." And it struck me then how refreshing honesty could be, how liberating it felt just to strip away the weight I'd shouldered alone. A few weeks later, my parents called my uncles over for dinner, and we all sat together, the kitchen table once again laden not just with food but with a sense of collective apprehension and hope. When the discussion turned to the will and my uncles had been given the full context of my parents' perspective, things changed. I watched as they spoke, voices rising and falling with emotion, laughter and sorrow spilling forth in equal measure. It became clear that bonds could stretch and twist but wouldn't easily break if we chose to approach each other with empathy rather than fists clenched in anger. With each shared story about their upbringing, about what our family's legacy meant to them, I felt the air lighten, the invisible walls we'd built around ourselves, slowly crumbling with every word spoken. In the end, I learned that while silence may sometimes feel easier, especially when wielded as a shield against discomfort, it can also isolate you just as much as any conflict. I realized that navigating family relationships, especially in the wake of hidden truths, demanded courage, a courage that often welcomes growth rather than resentment. As we settled into genuine conversation, I felt hope sprout anew. My family wouldn't just survive this, we'd find a way to thrive, learning to hold conversations that resonated with love and honesty. Even the hiccups along the way served a purpose, reminding us how valuable our connections truly were, especially when seasons of rediscovery were closer than we dared to believe. Update: a few months later, things have transformed completely. Our family reunions now feel almost like rebirths, where laughter mingles with open conversations, and we hold space for one another. My uncles even started a family project with my dad, turning an old shed into a community tool library for our neighborhood. It's beautiful, surrounded by greenery, echoes of chatter, and the sense of purpose we've created together. Who knew the truth could intertwine rather than tear us apart? Life isn't perfect, but every single gathering now feels so full of light, and I'm filled with gratitude for the journey. It's hard to sum up the feelings that swirl within me when I think about how things have changed. I remember the first family gathering after the truth spilled out into the open like the last drops of a long overdue rain. There we were, gathered in Grandma's backyard, a place that had been both sanctuary and battleground in my memories. The air felt electrified with a mix of apprehension and hope. It was the first time since our family dinner when everyone knew the narrative had shifted. I could see my uncles, eyes darting between the familiar, old family photo frames, shadowed memories, and the unfamiliar, a canvas of new experiences we were now creating together. When my dad proposed the idea of turning the old shed into a community tool library, it was met with a bit of silence, the kind that feels like the pause before a storm. I held my breath, half expecting one of my uncles to toss in an argument about money or inheritance, to feel the tension crackle again. But instead, I watched as it began to sink in for everyone. One uncle, the quietest among us, finally spoke up, his voice soft and a little shaky. "We could use this space for something good," he said, a light flickering in his eyes. I felt the tension fade in that moment. It was as if the universe shifted just a little, nudging us towards something better. As the days turned into weeks, our gatherings evolved into something closer to revivals, moments infused with laughter that felt both healing and authentic. We would sit around the fire pit, sharing stories that once would have gone uncrossed, tales of our childhood, lessons learned, heartbreaks endured. I noticed my uncles opening up about their own lives, vulnerabilities exposed like the petals of a blossoming flower. There was a remarkable softness when they spoke to me, their voices imbued with sincerity and a desire to connect that had seemed so distant before. There was a bond forming, tangible as the wood we were turning into shelves for the library. It was a beautiful thing to witness. It felt like watching a tapestry being woven, thread by thread, stitch by stitch, all colored by truth and understanding. When we finally gathered for the grand opening of the tool library, I stood back and took it all in. The shed had transformed, painted a deep green that blended perfectly with the surrounding trees, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh wood and laughter. Neighbors trickled in, and my heart swelled as I watched my uncles explain how to borrow tools to curious families. My dad stood next to them, beaming with pride. For once, they were not just my uncles, they had become community leaders, actively fostering connection and collaboration. Watching the joy flicker across their faces felt like a natural high, one that enveloped us all. There, in the warmth of that late afternoon sun, I realized that while we had stumbled through our own storms, we were now creating a lighthouse, something that illuminated our path forward. Reflecting on this journey, I felt a gentle sense of closure, the kind that doesn't erase the past but rather integrates it into something stronger, wiser. While the landscape of our family dynamic had changed forever, it felt as if we had welcomed a new chapter instead of mourning the old one. The future seemed less daunting, more inviting, like stepping into a vast, sunlit field rather than wading through murky water. I often think about how our initial fear of inheritance and material legacies morphed into an appreciation of shared experiences and memories created together. We realized that the true inheritance wasn't hidden behind walls of a grand home, but rather in the laughter and trust forged among us. As I look ahead, I no longer see them just as my uncles who might have held me at arm's length. They're my partners in this journey of growth, reminding me with every shared meal and exchanged story that family isn't merely defined by blood or bonds but by the willingness to come together in authenticity. And that truth, I've learned, is something worth cherishing far beyond any inheritance. Life is a creating and recreating cycle, and somehow, through it all, my heart remains full of gratitude, not just for how things have transformed, but for the love that has managed to intertwine our lives once more. As I sit here reflecting on the changes in our family, I can't help but smile at the way the world feels lighter now. It's almost surreal, the way an unspoken tension has been lifted, replaced by a warmth that envelops our gatherings like a cozy blanket. The first reunion after my revelation was a tentative affair, with nervous glances exchanged and silences hanging heavy in the air. Yet, as the sun sank low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, something shifted. My father started sharing stories of our grandfather, tales that spilled his laughter and life wisdom, and slowly, one by one, my uncles loosened up, joining in with their own memories, their voices blending like a harmonious song. These weren't just reflections of the past, they were seeds for our new beginning. Each laugh echoed with a hint of relief, and with every shared story, the walls we'd built around our hearts began to crumble. It was in those moments that we discovered we were still connected, despite the pain that had lingered for too long. As the months passed, we set to work on the community tool library, a project that not only renovated a physical space but also our emotional landscapes. I forged new bonds with my uncles, who revealed surprising depths to their personalities. One uncle had a knack for woodworking, while another had a passion for gardening. Together, they taught me how to repair rusted tools, turning mundane objects into treasures, much like the transformation we were undergoing as a family. On weekends, we'd gather at the old shed, which became a canvas for our creativity. Laughter filled the air as we sanded down surfaces, painted walls, and planted flowers around the entrance, breathing life into the once neglected structure. In those sunlit hours, I found healing amidst the sawdust and smiles. But the biggest surprise came when my uncles confessed their regrets about the distance that had grown between us all those years. They shared their fears of being perceived as distant or unsupportive, their intentions muddled by misunderstandings and silence. It was a sobering moment, simply listening to them. The air felt charged with vulnerability, like a precious gift exchanged between us. I shared my own struggles, my feelings of intimidation that had kept me at a distance, and slowly we realized how intertwined our experiences were. Each of us had been holding back, afraid that showing our true selves would push us further apart. It was difficult, peeling back those layers, but there was a profound sense of liberation in our honesty. The culmination of this journey came during our fall gathering, a time when the air would grow crisper and the leaves would transform into brilliant shades of red and gold. We decided to have a potluck, each family member contributing a dish that represented their favorite family recipe. As we gathered around the long table laden with food, I felt a rush of warmth wash over me, the beauty of simple moments shared with cherished people. We passed plates laden with food, each offering accompanied by stories that brought those dishes to life. My aunt's rich lasagna made with love, my uncle's spicy chili shared on cold winter nights, and my father's homemade apple pie that reminded us all of our summer harvests. With every bite, I realized nourishment wasn't just physical, it was emotional, forged in the trials we had weathered together. The laughter returned, but this time it was accompanied by a shared understanding of our vulnerabilities. The battles fought in silence had made the joy that much sweeter. And as the sun set, casting a warm glow through the trees, it felt like a real celebration, not just of the food but of us, our journey towards authenticity. As the echoes of laughter danced around us, I could feel the weight of the past slipping away, replaced by a newfound appreciation of family that went beyond mere obligation. My heart soared with gratitude for the wisdom of honesty, for the connections we managed to rebuild through embracing our truths. In this moment, I understood that not every story unfolds perfectly. The beauty lies in the chance to start anew, to cherish what we've built together, and to continue shaping a family that thrives on openness and love, a legacy worth far more than any inheritance could ever offer. It was a chill evening on New Year's Eve, the kind that held the promise of frozen fingers and warm hearts, but all I could think about was the weight of last year's responsibilities hanging over me like an unwelcome storm cloud. I could hear my family laughing and cheering in the living room while I sat on the wooden steps just outside the house, the chill penetrating through my jeans as I watched the colorful lights twinkle against the night sky. My name is Sam, and for the past 3 years, I had become the designated driver every single holiday. I loved my family, no doubt, but as the laughter echoed in the background, I couldn't help but feel a mix of resentment and exhaustion building within me. The beer-soaked promises of one last wild night had turned into a repetitive ritual where everyone else got to indulge while I faded into the shadows, always the one stuck waiting to make sure the fun didn't drive anyone into a ditch. The irony stung, especially when sort of a family tradition drew me away from the joy of the occasion. I knew I wasn't the type to start trouble, but tonight felt different. It felt like I was suffocating under the weight of expectations, a weight I had carried alone for far too long. So as midnight approached and my siblings began their enthusiastic chants of "Let's hit the town," while simultaneously cracking open drinks like it was an Olympic sport, I made the choice to step back. I decided I wouldn't partake this year, wouldn't shove the corks back into their champagne bottles or preemptively decline the drinks proffered to me. Instead, I summoned the nerve to voice what had been festering in my heart, and I found my father first, his hair turning silver under the living room lights, his laugh resonating like the chime of a joyful bell. "Dad, I need to talk," I said, feeling the lump of anxiety building in my throat. The laughter died down momentarily, and a palpable shift in the atmosphere flickered. "I'm not going to be the designated driver tonight." My family looked at me as though I had declared war on New Year's itself. The disappointment in their eyes stung more than I had anticipated, and while they, of course, understood the role I had played in our new tradition, my refusal was met with confusion followed by rising irritation, not just from my siblings but even from the adults who had initially cheered for my sacrifice. I heard the murmurs growing louder. "What do you mean? It's just one night. And come on, Sam, don't ruin it for us," echoed all around. My heart sank deeper with every voice, and doubts began worming their way into my mind. Could I really be that selfish? Was I truly ruining something so beautiful that we had shared? It felt as if guilt was wrapping around me like a tight blanket, smothering any hope of relief I had briefly felt. But just as quickly as the waves of uncertainty crashed in, they receded slightly when I decided to lay down my own terms. I proposed that we could all celebrate at home, together, no bar, no drunken escapades, just the five of us playing games, laughing, and counting down to the new year in the comfort of our own space. My mother's pleading eyes softened as they met mine, and I saw that she understood my need for balance. After a brief but intense back and forth that fizzled into silence, they ultimately agreed, albeit reluctantly. As we set up for a night under the glow of fairy lights and the warmth of shared laughter, I felt lighter somehow, as if I had carved an opening in the dam of expectations that had held me captive. We settled down to play games, eating homemade snacks, and toasting with soda as if we were the most sophisticated group of partygoers. In those moments of laughter, it became painfully clear that I had not ruined New Year's Eve. Rather, I allowed the festivity to shift from an obligation to a genuine celebration of connection that had felt lost amidst the chaos of tradition. Midnight arrived, and we cheered as one. I found myself wishing this would become our new ritual instead of the frantic runs to the bar and the drunken chaos our nights had often turned into. Now, reflecting on that chaotic night, I realized this was not merely an act of defiance but a necessary step towards reclaiming my joy in the midst of expectations. Everyone called it the most memorable New Year they had experienced since childhood, and I smiled a little when I recalled the surprise and glee in their eyes. Still, a small knot of anxiety clung to me, eager to know if my stance had indeed bruised familial bonds or somehow deepened them in the quiet of our shared moments. It wasn't until I received a text from my brother a few weeks later, thanking me for that evening, that I finally exhaled. "We can always go out next year, but I'm glad you stood your ground. It's time we return to what really matters," he said. I know now that sometimes, to embrace soul-deep happiness, one has to willingly stand against the tide and carve out their own space, catching tranquility amidst the noise. After all, joy doesn't only lie in the indulgence of reckless abandon but in the laughter exchanged in simple moments with the people we love the most. As the snow began to melt, revealing patches of earth long hidden beneath the winter's blanket, I found myself reflecting on my brother's message more often than I expected. It was odd how something that had started as a tense confrontation about my role as the designated driver had blossomed into a deeper conversation about our family's values. I spent time thinking about the chaos of that New Year's Eve, the loud music, the clinking glasses full of champagne, and the hazy laughter that seemed to surround everyone but me. Although I had been holding the weight of bitterness for being left out while my family indulged, my brother's kind words encouraged me to let that go. Life carried on, as it tends to do. Spring teased us with its gentle warmth, coaxing the world back into color. Yet, a sense of calm lingered like a forgotten melody from the past, and I began to crave more of that simplicity, more of those genuine, heartwarming gatherings that felt like home. I started initiating these moments, hosting small get-togethers where laughter and conversation flowed freely. We played board games, cooked meals together, and relished in the joy that came from spending time as a family without the distractions of a raucous night out. One Saturday evening, I invited my family over for dinner, fully knowing my mother would undoubtedly bring her infamous baked ZT and my father would come armed with a bottle of red wine that had likely been aging since before I was born. As the familiar smells wafted through the air, I took a moment to appreciate how much it meant to have the people I loved gathered in one spot, free from the pressures of expectation or indulgence. We began to share stories about our lives, and it was during this gathering that I realized my younger sister hadn't been quite herself lately. While everyone chuckled uproariously at my dad's corny jokes, I watched her face, which carried a glimmer of sadness behind her smile. Later in the evening, I pulled her aside into the quiet of the kitchen while the others continued their merriment in the dining room. She looked at me hesitantly, and my heart sank. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice soft and concerned. What unfolded was a tapestry of emotions, as she revealed worries about her own life decisions, feeling lost and pressured to keep up appearances. "I wish I could just be happy without feeling like I have to do what everyone expects," she confided, and in that moment, her words struck a chord deep within me. I wanted to tell her about the clarity I'd found since that tumultuous New Year's Eve, how it was okay to forge our unique paths in search of what genuine happiness felt like, but instead, I simply hugged her tightly. She seemed surprised, but after a moment, she melted into the embrace. As weeks continued to unravel, I saw my family transform, all of us nursing sprouted seeds of newfound understanding. Our gatherings morphed into mini rituals of love, no longer needing the chaos of parties or the allure of nightlife to find joy. We went on picnics at the local park, took day trips to the coast, and even set up a movie night under the stars in my backyard. Each time we gathered, unfiltered laughter echoed and the glimmers of hope rose in our hearts. Then, one evening, as the summer sun dipped below the horizon, bathing everything in amber light, my brother called me. "You know, I've been thinking," he said, his tone slightly hesitant, "I miss the way we used to celebrate the holidays without the stress." I hadn't expected that vulnerability from him, and it felt good to know that my stand held weight not just for myself, but for all of us. "Me too," I replied, a warmth spreading through my chest. "Let's promise each other that next New Year's, we create our own version of what celebration means to us, just us." As we spoke, I felt a bittersweet exhilaration. The new understanding among us transformed our previous traditions into something deeper, a rhythm that reflected who we had become rather than who we used to be. I realized then that standing my ground had sparked a revolution of sorts, in the form of connection and understanding within my family. It was a journey of rediscovery, where we learned that self-advocacy could pave the way for authentic relationships. And as the next New Year's Eve approached, I no longer felt the heaviness of the past, rather, I carried a placid certainty that our celebration would be remembered for its simplicity rather than revelry, for its acceptance rather than pressure. Reflecting once more on the past year, I understood more clearly now that shifting tides, though daunting, could lead us back to the shores of our own happiness, where the heart is light, laughter is abundant, and every moment spent together feels like a gift. I smiled at the thought of it all. Sometimes, to catch tranquility amidst the noise, you simply have to be brave enough to carve your own path. As the days passed into the new year, I often found myself thinking of my brother's text, his words echoing in my mind like gentle reminders of the importance of authenticity. It was invigorating, really, to feel that I had been true to myself, allowing the roots of tradition to pull us closer rather than tear us apart. My family had always been like a tightly wound clock, each spinning hand representing a different personality, a distinct desire. But somewhere along the way, we had lost the harmony of a simple timepiece, opting instead for a dazzling but chaotic illusion of celebration. I found solace in knowing that I had helped reorient that clock just a little, allowing us to tick in rhythm once again. New Year's Day dawned brightly, the winter sun streaming through the frosted windows, painting the room in hues of gold. The warmth of family filled the air, laughter erupting as my nieces and nephews darted around, their tiny feet padding eagerly across the floors, picking up on a contagious energy that promised adventure in the mundane. We gathered around the table, a feast of comfort food laid before us, rich with the sense of roasted meats and home-baked breads, and that familiar twinge of nostalgia pulled me back to childhood. We shared stories, moments of joy, heartache, and past resolutions colliding in a beautiful mess of chatter and shared laughter. I felt a swell of gratitude watching my parents, their faces softened with age but animated with love, gleaming as they witnessed the whirl of activity. My mother glided in with a tray of desserts, her smile radiating warmth, and for a moment I was reminded of the countless New Year celebrations we had inadvertently sidelined for busier, more extravagant gatherings. Wandering through the gentle living room chatter, thumping music, and the intoxicating aroma of baked goods, I recalled the feeling of disillusionment I had once held about family gatherings. There was something so profoundly satisfying about stepping back and creating a quieter kind of connection, one untainted by expectations. We played board games that day, nothing elaborate, just the classics that brought a sense of familiarity and connection. I felt the worries of the past year melt away in those moments, absorbed in the simple joy of companionship, shared victories, and playful banter. My sister and I shared glances often, nodding knowingly, our hearts full as we recalled that fateful New Year's Eve of change. As evening drew near, and the sun sunk low, the golden light outside transformed into soft hues of lavender and indigo. I took a moment to step outside, breathing in the crisp air filled with the scents of pine and freshly fallen snow. I stood quietly on the porch, letting the chill wrap around me. From where I stood, I could hear laughter bouncing off the walls of our home, the sound resonating like music through the night. In that serene moment, I pondered how the world outside felt cold and chaotic, yet within the walls, everything was warm, safe, and messy, real. As I reflected on my decision from that previous New Year's Eve, I realized it wasn't about refusing fun or indulging in dullness, it was about saying yes to connection over chaos, love over obligations. I had discovered a new definition of joy. When I finally stepped back inside, the raucous laughter enveloped me like a long-lost friend. My heart soared as my brother rushed over to claim his turn at the board game, and I noticed the unspoken unity that hung in the air around us, an evolution from past mistakes into something beautifully different. As midnight approached, we all gathered, ready to face the upcoming decade together, a family again in tune with one another. When the clock struck 12, we exchanged hugs, whispered wishes for the year ahead, and breathed together in the promise of what was to come. There, surrounded by the echoes of laughter and the warmth of shared hearts, I understood that the path I chose had not just changed my journey but had rekindled a bond that was stronger and more assertive than ever, reminding me that sometimes, the bravest thing we can do is to embrace the ordinary. The richness of those moments would remain, timeless and golden, echoing softly in the chambers of our hearts. Every Friday, as twilight began to drape its velvet shadow over my town, I found myself slipping into an abandoned version of our world, a realm I had only begun to understand. My name is Sarah, and at 32, I was navigating the messy waters of adulthood with the grace of a swan on ice. I had a job I loved as a graphic designer, a small but cozy apartment, and a close-knit group of friends who would gather over wine and laughter every weekend. Yet beneath the surface of my seemingly idyllic life simmered a strange phenomenon. Every Friday, with the onset of night, I stumbled into this alternate reality where everything felt both eerily familiar and paradoxically different. It started innocuously enough, just the usual urge to take a solitary walk to clear my mind after a hectic week. One evening, I meandered through the park, where the scent of damp earth filled the air and streetlights flickered like stars awakening, when I felt a sudden chill dance along my spine. That was the moment everything changed, as I found myself staring down an alleyway I had never noticed before. The air grew thick and heavy as I stepped inside, and what unfolded felt like a scene from a long-forgotten dream. It was a fractured mirror of our world. Skyscrapers leaned unnaturally, their windows shattered, and the streets were littered with remnants of a bustling life that once thrived. The silence was almost deafening, punctuated only by a soft whisper of wind that seemed to carry the echoes of laughter and conversations long lost. Each week, I wandered deeper, meeting shadows that mirrored my own life, shapes of people I recognized but were stuck in time. There was Jason, my ex-boyfriend, sitting forlornly on a park bench with an unreadable expression, and my childhood friend Lily, trapped in a loop of tying her shoelaces, eyes glazed and unseeing. It was agonizingly beautiful and heartbreakingly tragic all at once. Even though a part of me wanted to shake them awake, to remind them they were part of a world that moved forward, I felt an inexplicable bond with them, a sense of shared longing for what had been lost. Every encounter brought more questions than answers, and a knot of guilt lodged itself in my chest. Was I abandoning these versions of my friends? I found comfort in the stillness they provided, a stark contrast to the chaos of life outside this broken reality, yet it was a bittersweet solace. The emotions tangled within me, weaving a fabric of unresolved feelings I had yet to confront. Driven by a mix of curiosity and a need for closure, I questioned my own reality, Was I merely a spectator in this parallel existence, or had I become an unwilling participant in the decay of what used to be? After weeks of wandering, something extraordinary happened. One Friday, as the sun dipped below the horizon, swallowing the remnants of daylight, I found myself holding the hand of past Sarah, a version of me caught in a moment of vulnerability, crying over the remnants of lost dreams. In that moment, I realized she wasn't merely a reflection, she was a part of me, and her pain was my pain, an echo of my fears and regrets. I squeezed her hand tight, and a warmth surged between us, an understanding that we were allowed to feel all of it, the joy, the sorrow, the unfinished stories. I took a breath, exhaling the weight of expectations, and whispered promises of resilience, coaxing her to step into the light of possibility. When the dawn broke, pulling me back to my own world, I carried that moment with me. I understood now what this strange journey had been about. It wasn't just about fleeing into shadows but confronting what lay within. The following Fridays came and went, and with them, I chose to embrace both the hazy memories and the bright future waiting for me. I sought therapy, started journaling again, and reached out to the people I had neglected, rebuilding those connections with renewed vigor and honesty. In reflection, every weekend became an opportunity to grow, to heal, and to evolve. I never saw that abandoned world again, but perhaps it existed in the whispers of my mind, urging me to confront the echoes I had long kept at bay. It was strange but liberating. There was no need to return to a world that was never mine to mend. Life persisted, with its beautiful messiness, and I was ready to embrace it all anew. Update: a few months later, after harnessing my newfound sense of hope and strength, I invited my friends over for a gathering. I shared my experiences with them, how fear and joy intertwined in our lives, how we each carried shadows of past selves within us. To my surprise, they opened up too, revealing their struggles, the dreams that slipped away, the relationships that faded. We laughed and cried together, transforming what could have been an ordinary evening into something profoundly beautiful. In that moment, I realized that while my journeys into the abandoned world were over, the true exploration of life had only just begun. The warmth of our shared stories lingered in the air long after my friends left that evening, their laughter echoing in the silent corners of my home like a comforting blanket. I sat among the remnants of our gathering, the empty glasses, the discarded pizza boxes, the faint smell of burnt candle wax, and let the realization of our newfound connection wash over me. It struck me how easy it was to get lost in the grind of everyday life, focusing on the mundane tasks and brushing aside our emotional landscapes as if they were clutter. But that night, we had revealed our vulnerabilities, we peeled back the layers we wore for the world, showing glimpses of the pain and passion that simmered beneath. It was a cathartic release for all of us, a pact to keep our hearts open, no matter how scarred they may have been. As the days went by, I found myself seeking the presence of my friends more often, each gathering becoming a ritual of sorts, small fires of connection. Against the chill of life's uncertainties. We shared coffee before work, late-night walks under stars that appeared more vivid than ever, and even those awkward moments of silence that spoke volumes about our growing trust. The abandoned world where I once escaped felt increasingly distant, a fading echo of solitude in contrast to the vibrant tapestry we were weaving together. Yet, sometimes, an unfamiliar shadow would brush against my thoughts, a faint reminder of the solitude I once found comforting. One Friday night, as I prepared for another gathering, the air thick with anticipation, I glanced out of my window and spotted a figure in the distance. An overwhelming sense of déjà vu washed over me. I recognized the silhouette from my previous encounters within that parallel realm. It stood still amidst the swirling wind, a tangible piece of my past resurrected in the real world, its presence unsettling yet oddly magnetic. My heart began to race with a mixture of fear and disquiet. Had my journeys truly ended, or did the abandoned world still seep into my reality? I pushed the thought aside and joined my friends, our conversations flowing like an unbroken river, laughter bubbling through the thick evening air. But the figure lurked in the corner of my mind, demanding attention. It became an unwelcome guest at our feast, lingering there, causing my smile to falter and my laughter to sound hollow at times. As the night carried on and my friends' stories unfurled, I fought to focus, yet every time I glanced outside, there it was, steadfast and unyielding. That following night, sleep evaded me like a wary wild animal, and I found myself staring out into the dark. Something compelled me, an insatiable thirst to confront whatever ghost of my past was anchored in the shadows. I slipped out of my house, leaving behind the warmth of camaraderie, unsettling excitement coursing through me. As I approached the figure, I felt a magnetic pull drawing me closer, despite the nagging fear that crept into my thoughts. the urgency to uncover the truth wrapped around me like a scarf on a cold winter night. When I finally stood before it, the figure morphed into an ethereal version of myself, an echo from the abandoned world, draped in garments that seemed woven from air and despair. "You left me behind," it whispered, the voice unfamiliar yet intimately familiar, echoing the unresolved parts of my spirit. The words dug deep, but instead of fear, a wave of recognition washed over me. "I didn't leave you, I transformed," I replied, my voice steady despite the shivering uncertainty in my heart. We stood there, two halves of the same story, the weight of everything unspoken suspended in the air like a thick fog. "You can't run from what you've been," the phantom self cautioned, "but you can accept it." The truth nestled within me at that moment. No longer was I that figure trapped in desolation. I understood now that both aspects of myself were valid, not separate but interconnected, each yearning for recognition and acceptance. With a newfound resolve, I stepped forward, embracing the other me, feeling the cold slip away and warmth fill the air between us. "I understand you," I murmured, "and I won't forget you." It had all led to this nexus, this moment of convergence of past and present. The figure shimmered before me and gradually began to dissolve like mist at dawn. In that transformative moment, I realized that our struggles didn't define us but rather enriched our existence. They interwove into the fabric of who we were and who we were becoming. When I returned home, I sensed a profound stillness around me. I slid back into bed, cradled by the quiet, the echoes of our gathering still mingling with my thoughts, now clearer and brighter. Each relationship, each struggle, each laugh shared had not just been an escape from the abandoned world but a pilgrimage toward wholeness and acceptance. As I drifted off to sleep, I understood that my journey had only just begun, the threads of connection promising the warmth of love, hope, and understanding in a world both expansive and beautifully intimate. Update: a week later, I received an unexpected message from one of my friends, who revealed that after our last gathering, they had decided to pursue a passion they had long abandoned. Through our conversations, they realized how much they had been missing out on by burying their dreams. They were taking steps to reclaim their life, inspired by that evening's vulnerability. I felt an overwhelming tide of gratitude, knowing that the parallels of our lives would continue to entwine in unexpected ways, far beyond what I had initially imagined. Each Friday now carried a promise, a chance to expand our worlds together, simultaneously exploring the depths of our pasts while forging paths into a brighter future. As the weeks passed, our Friday gatherings became something I eagerly awaited, a soft beacon amid the tumult of everyday life. Each meeting transformed into a safe harbor where we could shed our masks, nurturing a bond that felt both fragile and resilient at the same time. We shared stories of progress and setbacks, each tale echoing with laughter or laced with the bittersweet recognition of our past regrets. I watched my friends dive headfirst into their passions. Clara picked up painting again, her once dormant creativity swirling back to life in vibrant hues, while Jake, a former musician, dusted off his guitar, the strings quivering in anticipation as he strummed melodies that had long been silenced. On one damp Friday evening, as a gentle rain tapped on the windows, we gathered in my living room, sipping tea and wrapped in the warmth of our camaraderie. The air was thick with shared ambitions and relentless hopes, and as the rain pattered softly against the glass, Clara stood up, her hands shaking slightly as she held a newly completed painting. I painted this for all of you," she announced, her voice vulnerable yet steady. We turned our attention, and I felt breathless as the canvas came into view, alive with swirling colors that seemed to dance in harmony. In the center of the piece stood a radiant sun, the golden rays extending outward, touching smaller images woven into the fabric of the painting, notes from a musical score, vibrant flowers in an untamed garden, and silhouetted figures embracing beneath the sky. Each element echoed our shared stories, bringing the impossible together in a dazzling display of possibility. My heart swelled as Clara shared the inspiration behind her painting, revealing it to be a tribute to our newfound resolve, a reminder that life, much like her art, was a blend of light and shadow. Each story, each contribution, tied into the greater tapestry of who we were becoming, a poignant reflection of our intertwined journey. But underneath the laughter and paint, there lurked an unspoken undercurrent. I could feel it creeping into our gatherings like the fog that sometimes settled in the valley, a lingering fear that perhaps this sense of rebirth was all too fragile, that the momentum we'd built might slip through our fingers like grains of sand. So, that night, as we wrapped up our discussions and prepared to bid each other farewell amid hugs and promises to return, I decided to let my anxious thoughts spill out. What if this all goes away? I asked, the weight of apprehension evident in my voice. What if we lose this spark? Silence enveloped the room, a collective breath held tight, until Jake broke it, his expression earnest. But what if we don't? What if we just make it a part of our lives, weave it into everything we do? It's worth the risk, isn't it? His words resonated within me, filling the space with an understanding that while the fear of change was a valid one, the courage to embrace it was something we all shared now. Our paths would not always be straight, and we would face obstacles ahead, but we had each other, the threads of our stories now woven together in ways that felt indelible. In the weeks that followed, we established a routine, a cycle of inspiration that pushed us beyond mere discussion. Clara organized a mini art show displaying her work inspired by our gatherings, and Jake penned lyrics for a song that captured the emotional essence of our shared journey. I struggled, too, dipping my toes into writing for the first time, words spilling onto the page as I explored the shadows I once thought were too dark to face. We became a collective of dreams, a sounding board for support, where failure became a learning tool rather than a conclusion. Yet, each Friday, there was still the nagging thought in the back of my mind, would this last? What would happen when life interjected and we found ourselves distanced again? One night, amid songs and artwork, Clara shared something that shook the very core of my worry. She reminded us that our relationships, those threads that connected us, might stretch, but they would never break. The vulnerability we had forged would allow our paths to remain intertwined, even during hard times. I pondered her words deeply as the weeks rolled by, the thoughts spinning like a top in my mind as I observed the changes in all of us. While life wasn't linear, perhaps the connections we built could guide us through its winding paths. Then, one crisp evening, as the trees outside began to shed their leaves in a vivid mosaic of color, so too did we shed our old selves, admitting the depth of our fears and joys. With every shared meal, every laugh, and the tears that sometimes fell freely, we started to understand that vulnerability was not a weakness but a wellspring of strength. By trusting each other with our truths, we created an unassailable support network, each of us vowing to cling tightly to the hope that had begun to unfurl within. As autumn painted our town in shades of rust and gold, I no longer feared that the world we had built would crumble. Instead, I welcomed it with an open heart, understanding that the beauty of our bond lay not just in what we shared, but in the promise of becoming, of growing and changing together. As I looked around our circle, illuminated by the warm glow of soft candlelight, I felt a calmness settle over me. The Fridays were no longer a way to escape into the past, they had grown into a celebration of our present and the radiant future we were all learning to embrace. And as I let out a soft breath, the words of our lives merging into one symphony of resilience echoed in my mind. This was only the beginning. Update, as a final note, I want to share something unexpected that emerged as we continued this journey together. Jake approached me last Friday, excitement shimmering in his eyes, and revealed that he had been writing pieces not just for himself, but for a new collaboration. He mentioned that he was planning to form a band, pulling Clara and me into the mix. The idea of sharing our stories through music and art on an even larger stage frightened me, but looking at the smiles of Clara and Jake ignited something within me, a spark of possibility. So here we are, a week later. I've agreed to join them, taking on the challenge of writing lyrics alongside Jake. The fear remains, but now, more than ever, I recognize the importance of stepping out of my comfort zone. I am ready to explore life's mysteries, both on that canvas and in those melodies. I breathe a little deeper as I consider what lies ahead, whatever it may be. I know it will be an adventure worth sharing, as we continue to shape our own beautiful, abandoned world together. It was supposed to be just another holiday gathering, filled with laughter, festive decorations, and a bit too much eggnog, yet it transformed into one of the most pivotal moments of my life. My close-knit group of friends had established a tradition of a white elephant gift exchange, where the goal was to bring something humorous or quirky to swap around the circle. This year, I felt inspired. After days of thinking, I decided to gift a vintage-looking box, aged like an artifact, wrapped in gold foil that glimmered under the twinkling Christmas lights. Little did any of us know, it was more than just an old box. To everyone's amusement, when my best friend Alex unwrapped it, inside was a scratch-off lottery ticket I had thrown in on a whim, just to keep things lighthearted. Laughter erupted when he scratched it off only to find out that it was worth over $1 million. At that moment, it felt like I was in a fairy tale. Yet, as the initial shock began to fade, a heavy feeling settled in my stomach, as excitement morphed into uncertainty. For days, we celebrated, a party filled with playful banter, immense joy, and, surprisingly, stakes that transformed the bonds of friendship into something frayed and fragile. The conversation soon shifted from congratulatory remarks to some friends expressing that, because the winning ticket had originated from my white elephant gift, I had an obligation to share the wealth. After all, the ticket had not just sprung forth from thin air, it was part of a game played between us. I remember sitting at home in my small, cozy apartment that night, staring at the blinking light of my phone as the group chat erupted with opinions, judgments, and a sense of entitlement that rattled me to my core. I began to feel torn. On one hand, I wanted to help my friends, especially since they had been my support group through thick and thin, but on the other, it was a significant amount of money that I had never expected to see, and it felt deeply personal to me. As I continued to navigate the whirlwind of discussions, some of my friends took it a step further, outright demanding their share of my newfound fortune. They argued that I shouldn't have even included the ticket as part of the gift, highlighting how, as the giver, I had unintentionally created this awkward position. My doubts began to grow into whispers in my mind, trying to convince me that I was the one who was being selfish and greedy. Such thoughts gnawed at me, leading to sleepless nights, but I also cherished the idea that perhaps this money could help me rebuild my life. I had been stuck in a rut, toiling away in a mediocre job that barely paid enough to cover rent and bills, and now I could not only pay off my debts, but I could also travel, invest in furthering my career, and maybe even start on that overly ambitious dream of mine, opening a small bookstore cafe by the coast where stories would seep through the walls like sweet laughter. But the rift grew. The gifts from Christmas became burdens that I contemplated every waking moment. To distance myself from the conversations that blurred the lines of friendship, I withdrew from the group chat for a time, taking each day to regroup. I took long walks in the nearby park, letting the cool air fill my lungs while my mind wrestled with the notion of entitlement. I even visited an old bookstore to distract myself, where I could lose hours wandering between the bookshelves that smelled of musty paper and adventure. Eventually, after a week of wrestling with my thoughts, I decided to face my friends. I arranged a casual dinner, a final gathering to resolve our unspoken tension. As the evening unfolded, I chose to be honest. I sat them down, carefully explaining how the ticket had landed in a box meant solely for fun, devoid of the weight of expectations and obligations. I wanted to stress that while they were my dear friends, the money felt deeply personal to me, a newfound hope for my future. I could see their disappointment, and truthfully, it pierced me. The laughter that had once echoed around us now felt muted. However, I also saw glimmers of understanding in their eyes, and that conversation provided the resolution we so desperately needed. It wasn't about who deserved what, but about maintaining the bonds we had nurtured over the years. As the night wound down, one friend, Clara, who had always been the voice of reason, gave me a reflective look. She smiled softly and stated, "You know, sometimes life throws us surprises, not to be shared or divided, but to change our paths." It struck me deeply. That moment became a tapestry of emotions, a blend of relief, sadness, and resolve. I chose to embrace the good that the lottery had brought into my life while also holding steadfast to the relationships that mattered. In the weeks that followed, I found my footing. I still communicated with my friends, but now it was with less pressure, and whatever division had sprung eased with understanding and communication. Instead of sharing a part of my winnings, I offered to treat them to a weekend trip to celebrate our friendship without the strings of money. And in many ways, the act of spending time together felt even more fulfilling than any monetary exchange. In the end, it was not just about the lottery ticket but about navigating the complexities of relationships and choosing to value friendship over obligation. Ultimately, the lottery had not stripped me of friends but led me to reassess what truly mattered, the authenticity of connections that would thrive regardless of wealth. Update: a few months later, I took another little leap. I followed my heart and opened that bookstore cafe. It was cozy and beautifully chaotic, filled with shelves of stories inviting all who came in. I was pleasantly surprised when some friends offered to contribute their time and skills to help me shoulder the load. Clara even stepped up and helped design the space, jarred mugs with coded messages printed on the sides for the secret menu. There's joy in seeing the delight on people's faces as they step into a world of books and coffee, and on Saturdays, when the place is bustling, I've realized that my path hasn't just changed, it's blossomed into something altogether beautiful. But just as everything was coming together, a shadow loomed over my little haven of caffeine and literature. It was a few months after our grand opening when I received an unexpected call from my brother, Mark, who, after a string of misfortunes, had moved back in with our parents. "You won't believe it," he said, his voice brimming with excitement. "I bought a lottery ticket, and I actually won $50,000. I could hear the triumph behind his words, and part of me felt uplifted by his good fortune, but another part of me squirmed at the implications. After all, during that white elephant gift exchange a few weeks prior, we had used the ticket as just that, a joke among friends, something to pass around for laughs, like the ugly sweater no one wanted. The ticket had cost a mere $10, but now it had transformed into an unexpected fortune. The problem lingered in the back of my mind like an itch. Should I pay my brother back for that ticket? My first instinct was to smile and celebrate his success, acknowledging his hard luck turning into a windfall. However, as I watched the cafe thrive, my initial goodwill began to warp under the weight of guilt. I hadn't contributed anything to that silly ticket, nor had I envisioned sharing the wealth or what it might mean for my brother to suddenly have significant amounts of money. It shouldn't be a burdensome obligation, should it? The constant flirtation with self-doubt made my heart race. As I ruminated, I also felt a growing resentment rise against Mark. He was back with my parents, lacking direction, while I had pulled myself together to create something fulfilling. Every week, he kept bringing up potential ideas for what he could do with the winnings. A vacation. Then a new car. In those moments, I found myself resenting that $10 ticket more and more. Weeks passed, and I noticed more requests from Mark. While the cafe had become a green and nurturing space for creativity, Mark's intentions weighed heavy on me. "Why don't you just loan me a little bit to get started?" he'd suggest, each word slithering into my brain like smoke. "You can always recoup it after I get my business going." One afternoon, as I stirred the rich, dark coffee, my stomach twisted with anxiety. Clara noticed and stopped by with a gentle touch to my arm. "What's bothering you?" she asked, and I hesitated before spilling my thoughts like beans into a grinding machine. She listened quietly, concern knitting her brow. "You're not obligated to share anything," she said finally, taking a sip of her espresso, "but you shouldn't feel guilty if you want to help." But there was more to it. It was the emotional knot I had with Mark, our childhood, entwined in responsibility and rivalry. I resented the fact that he had the ability to get something for nothing while I had to build everything from my courage and sweat. One Thursday afternoon, I finally decided to confront him. "Listen, Mark," I started, holding the phone to my ear, feeling the warmth of the cafe's summer breeze danced around me. "I know you're excited about your winnings, and I'm happy for you, but you need to understand. I can't help with your plans. That ticket was never mine to claim or share." His silence felt heavy, a moment too long before he spoke. "Wow, so that's it?" The chill in his tone froze me in place. It felt dreadful but necessary to stand firm, to balance the weight of harsh truth with the buoyancy of love. "But it's my ticket," he continued defiantly. "You were there when I bought it. It's not just luck, I could have picked another ticket, you know? Be better. Be supportive." With every word he poured out, my resolve thinned. "I'm trying to be supportive, Mark, but you can't expect me, of all people, to just distribute money when I'm still figuring out my own life." Somehow, I managed to hang up without feeling like a complete jerk, and as I processed the conversation, I finally felt a flicker of relief. Time passed, and the confrontation became a raw, necessary wound that slowly healed. Through the simmering tension with my brother, I found clarity about my own dreams. The cafe continued to thrive, filled with laughter, warmth, and the soft scent of beans roasting in the back. Clara became my confidant, and together we hosted small writing workshops, each word crafted under the light of connection. Despite the distance with Mark, I began to accept that his choices were his own, separate from my journey, as I found empowerment in the depths of the rooted relationships I built day by day. Months later, I received a text from Mark, one that was devoid of the old bitterness. "Hey, I went on a little trip. It was great. Hope the cafe's doing well," he wrote. A simple note that felt woven with maturity and intent. I responded, letting him know how much the cafe had grown. I didn't owe him anything, and while our relationship became more distant over time, I couldn't help but feel a thread of hope weaving back through our connection, fragile yet promising, just like the very venture I cherished. As I stood behind the counter one morning, with sunlight spilling golden rays through the window, I realized that sometimes, making choices for your happiness meant letting go of guilt, a lesson I hoarded quietly as I breathed in the intoxicating aroma of roasted beans and fresh stories yet to be told. The cafe continued to flourish, much to my delight. I leaned into the rhythm of each day, where the sound of the door chiming would greet me with the promise of new connections. One particularly crisp morning, I found myself overwhelmed with gratitude as I greeted regulars and newcomers. Alike, their smiles infectious, the aroma of brewing coffee wrapping around us like a soft blanket. Clara had this way of lighting up the room whenever she walked in, she carried an energy that was both calming and invigorating. That day, however, felt different. A magnetic energy buzzed beneath the ordinary hustle and bustle. I was preparing for a community event, one that Clara had suggested to foster deeper ties with our patrons. We decided to host a monthly open mic night, where writers, musicians, and poets could showcase their talents, a showcase of voices competing only with the sound of clattering mugs and warm laughter. It was during our final preparations, stringing fairy lights above the circular tables and piling chairs in cozy arrangements, that I noticed Jason standing outside the cafe, hands shoved deep in his pockets with that same familiar expression etched across his features, a mix of longing and hesitation. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. No matter how far our lives had drifted apart, the sight of him brought back a whirlwind of memories and a rush of old emotions. For a moment, I debated whether to invite him inside, but the fog of uncertainty clouded my decision. As the evening wore on and the cafe came alive, untouched notes filled the air, voices weaving tales both heartwarming and haunting. Clara's infectious laughter faded in and out as I caught glimpses of familiar faces sharing moments, and then, almost as if time had folded, Jason stepped through the door. The room hushed momentarily, strangers turned into an audience, and I felt my pulse quicken. He looked around, his eyes searching, and landed on me with a gaze so earnest that it melted the seconds into something palpable. I couldn't help but manage a weak smile, my heart oscillating between pleasure and panic. After the first act concluded, he approached me, and I could feel the vibrations of my surroundings dim, the clinking glasses and buzzing chatter fading into the backdrop of our shared history. "I came to see you," he confessed, his voice the same as I remembered but laced with a timbre of vulnerability I hadn't noticed before. I blinked, struggling for words. Here we stood, transformed by time, yet the undercurrents of unspoken sentiments lingered in the air like a fine mist. I asked him how he had found me, and the conversation spilled out like secrets carefully hoarded, revealing pieces of our lives since we last made contact. He told me about his trials, struggles with his decisions, and how he'd realized the importance of relationships that once mattered to him. Encouraging him to join the open mic crowd, I found myself eased by the moment. The fear I had pinpointed as regret fell softly as he stepped up to perform, seemingly transformed by the acceptance that enveloped him. As he shared his heartfelt song, the audience felt like a gentle embrace, and I couldn't help but lose myself in the harmony that wove through the room. There was beauty in the shared experience. It reminded me that reconciliation doesn't always seek perfection, but requires vulnerability and openness to growth. Our paths, so differently aligned, had somehow allowed us to converge again, revealing that understanding could form new threads, stitching old pains with the fabric of compassion. By the time the last act settled and the cafe's light began to dim, Jason and I found ourselves enveloped in a tranquil embrace of understanding. As I locked up and waved goodbye to the last lingering customers, who unfurled their stories into the night, I felt lighter than I had in a long time. Perhaps, I mused, mistakes didn't have to be anchors but rather lessons gently guiding us toward growth and renewal. With the sweet taste of coffee lingering in my mouth and the warmth of rekindled connection bubbling in my chest, I closed the door behind me, knowing that life would never cease to surprise me with its exquisite range of possibilities. I fell into a contemplative silence as I reflected on the days unfolding, grateful not just for the cafe, but for the chance encounters and unpredictable paths that lead us back to where we truly belong, whether with friends old or new, wrapped in the comfort of second chances. It was the kind of day that drags, one of those afternoons where the sun seems to hang just a little too long in the sky, every tick of the clock echoing through the quiet of my small therapy office, where I usually found solace among my books and wobbly old chairs. After a morning filled with mundane cases, anxiety, a sprinkle of depression, the usual suspects, my final appointment came in the form of a new patient who, unknown to me at the time, would shake the very foundation of my moral compass. When he walked in, I wasn't prepared for the weight of his presence. He was stooped but imposing, a heaviness about him that seemed to suppress the air. He introduced himself as Victor, and I could tell from his accent that he was not from around here. I later learned he was from a war-torn country far removed from my well-insulated suburban existence. At first glance, he appeared like any patient, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of nightmares and shadows. He sat in the chair across from me, those haunted eyes narrowing even further when I caught a glimpse of the scars, physical and otherwise, etched into his skin. "You have to promise not to judge," he said, a quiver in his voice revealing a hint of vulnerability. "I'm not who you think I am." It was an invitation and a warning, as if reality were temporarily suspended, and I found myself leaning forward, curious. As the session unfolded, Victor let slip snippets of his life, recounting tales of violence and chaos that would make a horror movie pale in comparison. He spoke of choices, of battles fought not only against enemies but against his own conscience, and I was struck by the absurdity of it all. I was confiding in a war criminal, a man culpable of atrocities I read about in history books. The ethical dilemma weighed heavily on me. What constitutes a person? Should I extend him the compassion I offered all my patients, or could he be irredeemable? As the weeks dragged on, I grew attached to Victor in ways I never anticipated. Each session grew increasingly intimate, laden with discussions of guilt, human nature, and the cyclical nature of violence. He was both a monster and a man seeking redemption. I began to find beauty in his tragic story, bewildered by how he reflected my own fears back at me. Maybe I wasn't just a therapist healing others but a fragile human being grasping for connection in a world teeming with horror. But one fateful afternoon, everything shifted. As he spoke of his past, of time spent wondering whose lives he had claimed in the name of war, a phone call interrupted our session. I instinctively picked up, only to hear a voice crackling on the other end. "We know who he is. He's a wanted man." My heart stammered. The confrontation of my unspoken fears had arrived at my doorstep. Shame surged through me for even allowing myself to feel sympathy for him. The line between right and wrong blurred starkly in that moment, and I widely opened my eyes, desperately searching for some illumination within Victor's steady gaze. "Do you know what you're doing?" I asked him, an accusatory whisper escaping my lips. To my shock, he smiled softly, an expression of understanding and serene acceptance. "I'm trying to come home," he replied, words heavy with implication. In that moment, I realized I had not just been his therapist but a kindred spirit. We sat in silence, a suffocating tension enveloping us as I battled with my professional duty against an unsettling sense of betrayal by my own empathy. When the session ended, my heart remained heavy, complicated, and confused. I didn't actually care, who had he been before? The person who sat across from me was alive, vulnerable, and paradoxically engrossing. The lines we often draw based on societal norms began to dissolve like sugar in warm water, leaving me disoriented yet intrigued, just wishing for clarity that never arrived. Weeks passed, and I knew I was facing a crossroads. I had to decide, continue treating him and risk my own conscience or sever ties altogether, never allowing the flicker of his humanity to shimmer in my mind again. In the end, I chose to continue our sessions, not because I believed he deserved forgiveness, but because, admittedly, I reveled in the complexity of his existence. I was learning about the human condition in its rawest form. The Psychiatric Association's guidelines, the law, my own moral compass, they all paled against the tapestry of human life I was slowly unraveling. I had not abandoned my ethics but instead had discovered a deeper narrative woven into Victor's story, one that transcended mere black and white thinking. I drifted further into this uncharted territory, committing myself to this man's journey toward redemption, even if it meant grappling with my own shadows along the way. For now, we would wade through the murky waters together, pieces of history intertwined, until clarity illuminated the darkness, if it ever would. Months later, I still found myself reflecting on that initial encounter, how I'd crossed paths with a war criminal who, while undeniably flawed, taught me a profound lesson in humanity. In the end, perhaps without the spark of madness that ignited this unlikely connection, healing could not have truly begun. As I continued my therapy practice, I found comfort in knowing that sometimes understanding rises from the ashes of the past, and the courage to face those shadows becomes a beautiful journey all on its own. As the months continued to unfold, I settled back into the rhythm of my therapy practice, letting the echoes of that initial encounter quiet down, but they never fully dissipated. The ember of our shared experience remained, quietly glowing in the recesses of my mind. My days were usually filled with the mundane yet gratifying tasks of helping others navigate their own turmoil, ordinary sessions punctuated by the lilting sounds of laughter or the occasional sob spilling forth beneath my watchful, empathetic gaze. However, I'd be lying if I said I didn't occasionally grapple with the strange weight of what I learned from my time with him, the man who carried remnants of war upon his shoulders, whose very name echoed like thunder in the stillness of moral conversation. We had exchanged stories that clung to the air between us, tough tales mottled with blood, but juxtaposed by his stark vulnerability. There was a surreal paradox in the way he navigated his undying guilt, the burden of lives lost and the iron chains of memory that clanked heavily in the quiet confines of our sessions. I knew, deep down, that some might balk at the very concept of treating such a soul. Disillusioned by my commitment, they would see this as a grave misstep driven by an overzealous idealism that turned a blind eye to the darker shades of morality. But for me, it evolved into a personal pilgrimage, peeling away layers to uncover something both terrifying and exquisite hidden within the human experience. Despite his history, I felt a task far greater than indictment rested upon my shoulders. It was about bridges and understanding, and the ache of recognizing that every antagonist could very well be a protagonist spun into the wrong story. The sun dipped low over the horizon in a golden farewell most evenings as I closed up shop, and each time I brushed past that creaky door, my thoughts would inevitably drift to him. That connection had shaped every earnest "how are you feeling?" and the gentle nudges toward progress I offered my clients. His haunting presence was like a ghost that had woven itself into the fabric of my life, an uninvited friend who refused to leave. Then came the day when he slipped back into my life, almost effortlessly, like the first drop of rain after a long drought. The clinic's phone rang with an urgency that promptly shattered my thoughts. I answered, only to hear his gravelly voice across the line, the kind that had once stuttered halting truths, now noticeably aged, echoing with fatigue. "I need to talk again," he said, a tremor in his tone, laden with either desperation or hope, perhaps both. My heart sank at the unease lining his words, a reminder of vulnerability sharper than glass. "Of course," I replied, a practiced calm enveloping my own bubbling uncertainty. "When would you like to come in?" We arranged for the next day, and as I hung up, the familiar anticipation flooded my veins, tangled with strands of anxiety. Despite all he'd shared, I wondered just how far the edges of his redemption could stretch. He arrived the following afternoon, a spectral sight clad in shadows and what felt like an ocean of burdens. We exchanged muted greetings, the weight of past sessions settling around us like an oppressive fog. I offered him a seat, the worn fabric whispering against the chair as he sank into it. His eyes were tired but kept alert, deeply searching as if willing me to see the fragments of a man who had been stripped down to the core. "I can't shake it," he admitted, his voice a raw whisper that sliced through the air. "The faces, the screams, they're all still there. I thought talking would help, but..." His words trailed off, leaving a palpable silence that bloomed between us. It felt familiar, each rhythm of his voice resonating with the resonance of our prior discussions, yet the frailness of his current state drew a stark contrast against the usually firm man before me. "I need a reason to keep going," he finally confessed, his anguish laid bare. It dawned on me then, the forgiveness he sought wasn't merely for himself, it was for the world outside, a world that had spun on without acknowledging the depths of his plight. I paused, crafting my words as carefully as a sculptor chiseling a marble block. "You've been through an unimaginable experience, and it's okay to grieve what you've lost, including parts of yourself." Encouragement was met with a deluge of bottled experiences spilling forth. He spoke of harrowing nights haunted by memories of despair and fleeting moments of humanity amid the devastation. It was an outpouring that spilled out over the juxtaposition of life and death, a hammer striking an already fragile heart. I listened closely, offering comfort and space for him to release his burdens. As he shared, I realized that my mere presence was creating a safe sanctuary for his pain. And in return, he was handing me insights into the complexity of humanity, the darkness intertwined with light, the monster wrapped in flesh yearning for understanding. The session meandered along the delicate threads of healing, and when it ended, a smile tugged at my lips. In that moment, what we found was shared resilience, a pact of empathy forged anew. As he walked out, lighter than when he entered, I felt our connection soothe my spirit. Outside my window, the sun dipped below the jagged edges of the horizon, casting everything in a glow that felt almost like fresh beginnings. Somehow, we had salvaged something vibrant from the depths, two souls crafted in fire, sharing an understanding that transcended mere shame or vilification. I knew then, in the ebbs and flows of life, we all carry shadows, but it's how we embrace the light that becomes the heartbeat of our stories. Months would pass again, but this wound would no longer press against the fabric of my soul. It was simply a reminder that healing takes many forms, and sometimes the bravest act one can perform is choosing to understand. It was early morning when I received the call that stirred distant memories, pulling me back into the realm of what had once felt like a fever dream. The familiar tone of my office phone cut through the stillness, echoing in the small, softly lit space where I often found respite among the flood of paperwork and therapy notes. The voice on the other end introduced itself as someone from the local clinic. A quick review of my ongoing cases had flagged some lingering concerns regarding one particular patient, Roberto. His name alone conjured an inexplicable mix of emotions. The bond we had forged itched at the edges of my consciousness, reminding me of the chaotic intersection of darkness and light that had forever changed how I viewed suffering and redemption. The directive was straightforward: I must assess his mental state again, as his behavior had begun to spiral back into the shadows. Soft murmurs of concern flared as I listened to the details, words like inappropriate outbursts and intense expressiveness wrapping themselves around the narrative of a man who had once been untouchable in my office, an enigma I had been compelled to understand. A part of me, however reluctant, was ready for this renewed confrontation. I held tightly to the memory of those long sessions where we navigated the raw, jagged edges of each other's truths, his tales of war, chillingly layered with nuance, and my responses, steeped in empathy, attempting to thaw the frozen armor he had forged through a lifetime of conflict. I could still picture him leaning forward, almost animated at times, as he recounted snippets from his past, the smell of distant gunfire, the weight of choices that even fate could not preordain. What had once felt like a burden to sift through now shimmered with the fervor of transformation, reshaping how healing could truly take form. I wondered if I could be his guide again, helping him inch back toward the flickering warmth we had discovered together. When I arrived at the small clinic, the air was heavy with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and unshakable tension. The waiting area felt eerily tranquil, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above as anxious patients clung to the pages of dog-eared self-help books. Roberto sat in the far corner, casting an imperceptible shadow against the walls painted in pastel blues, his hands tight around the frayed edges of his sleeves. Those familiar dark circles encircling his eyes told stories of sleepless nights, of memories refusing to fade. Our eyes met, and within that glance lay everything we had shared, the traumatic echoes of his past and the promise of exploration yet to come. The minute I took my seat across from him, the weight of those shared shadows enveloped us again, as immovable as the gravity of unspoken regret. "Are you all right?" I ventured, noting the slight tremor in his clenched fists. He drew a breath, deeply rooted in unease but tinged with resolve, a mix I had grown to recognize in our sessions. "Sometimes the past just doesn't want to stay behind," he replied, his voice gravelly yet strikingly sweet, like a stone plunged into murky waters, creating ripples of reflection. What followed encapsulated moments that were equal parts heartbreaking and enlightening. Stories tumbled out in jagged snippets, each revealing how the weight of his horrific choices felt heavier still in the light of accountability. As I listened, flashes of recognition flickered within me. All of us, in our own ways, were at war with ourselves, battling regret or shame, yet yearning for connection, a bridge between fractured histories and hope. With each session, I cherished the clarity that arose from our encounters, the understanding that slowly morphed from fear into acceptance, both for Roberto and myself. We weren't separate entities, we were interwoven vessels of experience navigating the escalating tide of emotions that threatened to drown us. He spoke of nights he couldn't close his eyes, of whispered faces that haunted him in fleeting dreams, yet with each confession, a pinprick of healing emerged, connecting us through shared vulnerability. One session melted into another, until bizarrely, the notion of guilt transformed into a raw, electrifying energy, less of an anchor and more of a compass guiding him toward understanding himself, even when he didn't completely believe the journey was justifiable. Months turned into a captivating rhythm of sessions, laden with profound exchanges of love, pain, and redemption. It became clear that he was beginning to redefine his narrative, weaving threads that had only previously been tainted in despair. Finding strength in the light, he learned to speak the truth while bearing that heavy weight. Each session felt like we were peeling back layers of a deeply rooted yet beautiful tapestry. I, too, was unearthing pieces of my own self in the process, questions of morality and humanity grappling within my mind, forging renewed perspectives while allowing empathy to flourish like newfound blossoms in early spring. The day he smiled, truly smiled, was etched like magic in my memory. "I want to be better." His words fell like gentle raindrops on parched soil, nourishing the parts of him still yearning for acceptance. I nodded, my heart swelling with pride, for here was a warrior unarmed, wrestling the ghosts of a haunting past. Understanding no longer shackled him but inspired him instead. Yet, just when tranquility seemed to blanket our sessions, whispers of unrest emerged from the clinic, echoing through the hallways about a potential release for Roberto. I found myself at a crossroads, battling anxiety as the thought of him re-entering society and grappling with a world reluctant to embrace those who'd once held the weight of war upon their shoulders tugged at my heartstrings. What if this journey of healing, still so raw, was to be disrupted by a society unwilling to forgive? Each day turned into a nebulous haze where hope and dread revealed themselves as two sides of the same coin. I sought solace in my memories of our progress, yet uncertainty loomed like a storm cloud overhead. When the day finally arrived, and the clinic called me in for one last session before his departure, the room felt electric with unspoken farewells. Roberto emerged quietly, almost reverently, his eyes reflecting an agonizing blend of gratitude and apprehension. As we exchanged the final words, a small part of me clung to the idea that I might see him again, managing to insist on finding connection amid the chaos, willing to embrace the discomfort of disparity. As he stood to leave, our eyes met once more, and I could see it, the light flickering in the depths of his gaze, the will to carry the lessons we had unearthed in the sacred space we'd nurtured. "No matter where you go, just remember to seek understanding," I said softly. Theirs was both familiar and alien, intricate tapestries made from war and healing, woven together. Months later, the world beyond the clinic hummed with its relentless rhythm, and I reveled in the quiet strength that silently fortified my practice and life. Healing is indeed a labyrinth, I mused, entwined within shadows and light, and as I reflected on the journey, I realized that sometimes the most painful paths illuminate truths long buried, waiting to re-emerge, the enduring truth that every heart holds the universe of battles fought and emotions shared. Perhaps the real journey lay not solely in the act of healing but in the unwavering spirit that rises, ready to embrace love and connection, even in the wake of madness. Every night, without fail, the air would grow thick with a heavy silence at precisely 10:52 p.m., as if the world had pressed pause on itself. Living in a small town like Brookshire, this unnerving ritual was an accepted part of life, a peculiar tradition that I had come to know for as long as I could remember. I would watch the clock tick down from my bedroom window, the cool moonlight casting long shadows across my floor, the only sound being the quiet hum of the ceiling fan. It was strange, really, how nobody ever spoke about it, not even in whispers. My parents never bothered to explain why every household, every shop, and even the streetlights would dim or flicker for 12 minutes each night, as if the entire town was collectively holding its breath. I often found myself puzzled, torn between my curiosity and an inexplicable instinct to just let it be, to let it weave itself into the fabric of my life like a long-held family secret. But that fateful summer night, curiosity won, fueled by a restless spirit and an idea that maybe, just maybe, I could peek behind the curtain of this nightly mystery that had haunted me. As I stitched together my plan, the thrill of uncovering a long-buried secret coursed through me like electricity, making my heart race with each passing second toward midnight. Armed with a flashlight and an insatiable need for answers, I slipped out of my room, careful not to disturb my sleeping parents. I stepped onto the cobblestone street, the night air crisp against my skin as I ventured down my familiar lane. I felt the familiar thrill of danger tingling along my spine, but I was fueled by purpose now. My best friend Jacob had always said that fear itself was just an illusion, a construct of the mind to keep us inside neatly wrapped boxes. Tonight, I was stepping out of mine, determined to find out what happened when the clock struck 11. As I approached the town square, I noticed the stillness, the shops darkened and locked, the park benches empty under the blanket of night. My pulse quickened. I had never been this close to the heart of the town during a lockdown. At 10:58, I ducked behind a large oak tree, its gnarled branches dipping low like bent old men in conversation. I could see the glow of the clock tower illuminating the street in soft gold, casting everything in a surreal haze. Then, suddenly, at 10:59, a wave of tension swept through the air, and the familiar flickering began. The town inhaled deeply, and I felt the breath of it rush past me, a wild wind rising but with no sound to accompany it. At 11 o'clock, the atmosphere shifted. I held my breath, straining to see beyond the shadows where the flickering flickered out entirely, leaving only the oppressive darkness draping over Brookshire. My flashlight's beam seemed feeble in comparison as I scanned my surroundings. Then I saw them, figures emerging slowly from every corner, gathering under the clock tower, their silhouettes merging and morphing into one another like the whispers of ghosts in the night. It was then that I realized the truth of the lockdown. They weren't ordinary townsfolk. They were different. They moved with a deliberate grace that sent chills running down my spine. As I stared in wide-eyed awe, I recognized familiar faces amongst the crowd, my neighbors, the shop owners, even the mailman, yet they wore strange expressions, devoid of any feeling I had ever associated with them. They seemed entranced, their eyes glossed over as they collectively shifted in rhythm, their bodies swaying as if conducting an invisible orchestra. I instinctively backed away, heart pounding in my ears, when I bumped into something solid, a single figure cloaked in dark fabric, its features obscured. I opened my mouth to scream, but panic paralyzed me, turning my voice to stone. That's when the figure leaned closer, a voice like gravel whispering, "If you want to know the truth, you must listen." The world around me melted into whispers, their secrets flying through the air, weaving tales of ancient pacts and sacrifices made to protect the town from the darkness beyond the edge of our small universe. Each night served as a mechanism of renewal, a moment to reinforce the bond between the town and whatever lurked outside our perimeter, a reminder of the fear that kept us all safe. Each of the 12 minutes before midnight allowed the townsfolk to offer up their fears, their regrets, to the void beyond. They would carry the weight of it while, for 12 minutes, Brookshire reclaimed its peace. As the clock struck 11 and the shadows began to disperse, everything settled into an eerie tranquility. I felt the oppressive weight of understanding settle over me like a shroud. I had learned something no one else had spoken aloud, a truth that forced me to see my home in a startling new light. I slipped away, my heart racing as I retraced my steps in the quiet night. By the time I was safely back in my room, shame washed over me. I realized that in seeking the truth, I had stepped away from the comforting lies that had woven the town together. I lay awake long after the clock had chimed again, the town clutching its secrets tight. What would I do with this knowledge? That night, for the first time, I understood the weight of my neighbor's silent burdens, and the following days felt different. I walked the streets of Brookshire with a growing sense of unease, unable to shake the feeling that something was very wrong, and yet so very right about the ritual that I had once found absurd. The updates to my daily life became riddled with reminders of that fateful night, the slight nods from shopkeepers, the knowing smiles from those who had participated willingly, and in those moments, I grappled with the choice between ignorance and understanding. Months passed, and though I hadn't shared this experience with a single soul, I noticed the town changing subtly. The conversations felt deeper, the laughter more genuine, as if we were all carrying the weight of knowledge with us. I pondered often, should I tell someone? Could sharing do more harm than good? In the end, I decided it was wisdom best left as a quiet companion, a ghost story of sorts, a tale that shaped my framework of perception about our collective existence and the invisible lines we draw to stay safe, because perhaps not all knowledge is meant to comfort. And each night, as the clock struck 10:52 and the town would lock down, I would breathe deep, thanking the universe for the moment I had taken a leap beyond the known, and into the deeper layers of what life in Brookshire truly meant. As the clock struck 10:52 every night, a sense of calm and acceptance settled over me, a warm blanket in the chilly embrace of the unknown. The routine had become an intricate part of my life in Brookshire, a place that often felt like a quaint postcard from the past, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Yet, as the siren wailed and the town fell silent around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was perched upon the edge of a precipice, gazing down into shadows that danced just out of sight. The first time I had experienced the lockdown, the eerie stillness that enveloped the streets, had been surreal. I was at a late-night study session with friends, the weight of midterms hanging heavy, our laughter spilling into the soft glow of the cafe's neon lights. Suddenly, the cheerful chatter was silenced by that haunting wail, and the cafe owner, a man with kindly eyes and a perpetual smile, turned off the main lights. "Don't worry, it will be over in just 12 minutes, he assured us, but the way his voice trembled slightly as he said it sent a chill down my spine. That first evening, curiosity gnawed at me. What could possibly happen during those 12 minutes that required our town to lock down every night? I began to dig deeper, asking friends and neighbors, weaving through rumors and anecdotes, a silent detective with no plan beyond satiating my curiosity. Most, it seemed, had long since accepted the routine. It was a part of life in Brookshire, whispered about but never dissected. Still, I was undeterred, driven by an insatiable urge to uncover the truth, to reveal the hidden stories tucked between the seams of our town's fabric. Nights turned into weeks, and I collected stories that spoke of strange occurrences, muffled sounds echoing through the air, flickering lights, and sometimes, faint reflections in the windows that vanished when looked upon directly. But no one ever spoke about what lay behind those 12 minutes. Perhaps I was foolish, but I felt a peculiar sense of connection to whatever secret lingered in the shadows. It wasn't until one fateful night that I stumbled upon an old journal hidden in the attic of my grandmother's long-abandoned house. The journal belonged to a distant relative, a woman who had been deemed an outsider in our town decades ago, a name whispered with a mix of reverence and fear. As I flipped through its fragile pages, I felt her despair, her isolation echoing through the years. She wrote of a darkness that had encroached upon Brookshire, a darkness that could not be spoken of openly yet haunted the town's collective memory. Her words were cryptic, but they painted a chilling picture of the past, filled with a sense of foreboding that mirrored my unease. Each passage spoke of the loud sirens, a warning of sorts, summoning the townsfolk to protect themselves from what lay beyond the safety of their homes. Tears pricked my eyes as I realized this journal, once a neglected artifact, now pulsed with urgency, as if the weight of history was begging for acknowledgement. The next evening, I felt compelled to share everything I had learned with the town council. A handful of reluctant faces gathered in the community hall. I presented my findings, my heart racing with the fear of rejection, of being branded the town's nouveau conspiracy theorist. Surprisingly, a gentle murmur rolled through the room. People shifted uneasily in their seats but listened. It was then that Mrs. Haddock, my high school history teacher now with silver streaks winding through her hair, spoke up, her voice a soft echo against the walls. The lockdowns were initially a precaution, she admitted, back when strange things began happening, children going missing, strange lights in the woods. We created protocols, trying to keep fear at bay. The air thickened with unsaid words, the fear we'd all been harboring surged to the surface. It became clear, amid the muted gasps and shifting murmurs, that we had all felt the tremors of something lurking, something unwelcome, and in trying to shield our community, we had silenced the very whispers that could have liberated us. Afterward, a woman approached me, her eyes weary. "My daughter went missing during the lockdown 3 years ago," she confessed, voice trembling. "I just thought it was all a coincidence, a sad part of life, but it was never discussed. All we did was follow orders." In that moment, I felt the weight of the town's collective guilt, a shared complicity in shielding ourselves from the dark while allowing it to infiltrate our lives through silence. I understood, finally, that the knowledge we held wasn't just a burden, it was a catalyst for change. Over the following weeks, I wrote to each of my neighbors, shared stories, opened channels of communication, and we began to speak, not in fear, but with hope. The 12 minutes became a platform for healing. We marked that time by uniting, creating rituals of remembrance for the lost, a declaration that we would not let history repeat itself. It was empowering to reclaim our narrative, to turn shadows into light, and slowly, the sirens transformed from dreadful reminders into signals of resilience. I began to realize that, sometimes, tearing down the walls we build was necessary, not just for our peace of mind but for the collective heart of a town that had been silenced too long. And as night fell and the sirens rang true, I joined my neighbors on the front porch, sharing our stories, reclaiming our past, and building a future free from the chains of dark whispers. The fear transformed into a gentle solidarity, as recognition settled in. That night, as the clock struck 10:52, I took a deep breath, allowing gratitude to wash over me, not just for the truth revealed, but for each soul that dared to be vulnerable, to share a story, to embrace the discomfort that eventually led to our coming together. Little did I realize that this was just the beginning. The nights that followed unfolded with a surprising cadence of trust and connection. Every 10:52 brought with it not just the sound of the sirens marking the lockdown, but the unmistakable sense of unity that had been forged in our shared vulnerability. Each evening, more families joined us on the porch, stories flowing like warm honey, sticky and sweet, their narratives intertwining with one another, creating a tapestry of lives colored by hardship, resilience, and kinship. We spoke of old neighbors long forgotten, of the eccentricities that once defined our small town, and of the chilling events that led to our customs, each revelation a thread pulling tighter around our community, stitching the fabric of Brookshire back together. I discovered Mrs. Thompson had once been a gifted violinist, performing with a local symphony before the lockdown enforced her seclusion, and I encouraged her to play once again. The mournful notes she produced carried a haunting beauty that seemed to echo our past sorrows while beckoning hope towards the future. But it wasn't only the adults who found their voices, even the children, who had previously been hushed by the fatigue of our town's rumors, began to share their dreams and fear, whispers of monsters under their beds emerging lightheartedly transformed into shadows of the unknown that haunted us all. As the days slipped by, I watched the essence of Brookshire metamorphose. The self-imposed barriers that once shackled us fell away, replaced by a sense of belonging that filled the gaps of our lives. Neighbors ventured away from their homes after the lockdowns were lifted, engaging in spontaneous community events. I found myself enveloped in this whirlwind of rekindled friendship, revitalizing not just our town but also my sense of purpose. One chilly evening, after another night of storytelling, we decided to shift the lockdown. Rather than retreating behind closed doors at 10:52, we would share a meal, a simple gathering to acknowledge the passage of time and the strength we had collectively developed. So Friday became our unity night. Candles flickered on tables sprawled end to end across Main Street, laughter mingled with the lingering silence of the sirens that would still wail, serving as a reminder of what we once faced, but also of how far we had come. However, as the weeks rolled into months, I started to feel a peculiar tug at my heart, a flutter of unresolved tension that I couldn't quite place. Every so often, I'd catch fleeting glances of unease hidden beneath the smiles shared over meals. I noticed that each night, some families still chose to stay behind locked doors, as if they held fast to an instinct that warned them not to fully embrace this newfound peace. One night, a particularly fierce storm battered Brookshire, and the sirens howled through the air, mirroring the thunder above. The lights flickered, and after a moment of hesitation, our gathering dispersed, people reluctant but ultimately retreating to the safety of their homes. Little did I know, as I settled into bed that evening, that my fleeting concerns were about to crystallize into something far more real. The next morning, just before dawn's light began to spill across the horizon, a frantic knock on my door jolted me awake. It was Mr. Holloway, the town's old librarian, who looked pale and shaken. He gasped for breath, his voice barely above a whisper as he beckoned me outside. "It's happening again," he said, "you have to see." We hurried down the street, following the shadows of our neighbors emerging from their homes, all us drawn together by a mutual fear. The streets of Brookshire felt like a haunted morning, mournful and heavy. As I stepped outside, the atmosphere shimmered with something otherworldly. Our community gathered at the center of town in wide-eyed confusion, murmurs of disbelief echoing the early mist. Then it came, a sudden and powerful shift in the air as a figure appeared at the edge of Ellis Park, bathed in the gray light of dawn. It was an old woman, her face weathered with lines wrapping around cautious blue eyes, an aura that tugged at something deep within me. In her hands, she held what appeared to be a large, brightly painted box adorned with swirling designs reminiscent of the stories we had been sharing. "When the townsfolk forget the darkness that comes after the lockdowns," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady amidst the tension, "the darkness will remind them." A chill pierced the air as she opened the box to reveal strings of delicate memories, old photographs, crumpled letters, and fragments of forgotten lives, pieces of Brookshire long lost and nearly erased from our minds. They danced and flickered in the wind, releasing a wave of whispered voices that echoed through the town, triggering every locked memory of pain, neglect, and fears we had tried to bury. As I watched in horror and fascination, I could feel the energy of the past surging through the crowd, feeding off each individual's shame, guilt, and curiosity for the life they once lived. What does this mean? I wondered, my heart racing between dread and the need for answers. The woman's eyes met mine, and for a moment, the fear evaporated. She offered a knowing smile. "Embrace it," she urged, "and decide for yourselves how to let it shape you." At that moment, I understood what had happened during those surreal nights of sharing. We had built something beautiful in the wake of darkness, a new tradition where vulnerability turned into strength. However, the stories we buried were still there, existing in the fabric of our town, yearning to be recognized. We could no longer lock down our fears nor ignore the consequences of our past. We united not just in declaring our old pain but in acknowledging it together. And so we did. In our newfound circle of acceptance and resilience, we began to share once more. The fears and sadness would not diminish our light, instead, they would guide us towards growth. As the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, the town of Brookshire stood together, brilliant and renewed, prepared to embrace whatever lay ahead while carrying every piece of who we were beneath our shared story. The box of memories became a symbol, reminding us that while we may lock down at twilight, it was the unlocking in the light of day that truly defined our existence. I never expected my career as a mental health therapist would introduce me to something so unsettling, something so beyond my understanding that it would leave an indelible mark on my life. I've spent years working in various clinics, hearing people pour out their fears, anxieties, and traumas, yet I never prepared myself for the day I would meet Drew, my new patient who quite literally lived in a basement. It started on a cloudy Tuesday, just a typical day at the office, when I received an unexpected referral to see a patient in dire need. The organization informed me that the new patient was a young man in his late 20s, living at his parents' house, but the caveat here was that he had taken residence in their damp, dark basement. Perhaps I sensed the curiosity mingling with apprehension as I entered that basement for the first time, descending the rickety stairs under the dim light fixture that flickered ominously. When I first laid eyes on Drew, sitting curled up in the worn armchair littered with mismatched blankets and half-finished novels, he didn't seem out of place at all. He looked like one of those characters, deeply intriguing, yet profoundly damaged. As we started our sessions, I learned more about him. His voice was soft yet unwavering, full of wisdom that belied his years. Drew revealed he was an aspiring writer, but his creativity was stifled not only by his crippling anxiety but a family history riddled with mental health struggles that seemed to hover over him like a thick fog. The reason he confined himself to the basement was twofold. 1, he felt safer from his overbearing parents, and 2, it had become a sanctuary where he could tiptoe along the fragile line between reality and his vivid imagination. Slowly, week after week, he unspooled the terrible tapestry of his life, and with every session, I felt more connected to him. I, too, grappled with a blend of empathy and unease, wondering if I was genuinely offering him the help he needed or simply peering into a disquieting parallel of my own existence. His stories had begun to weave themselves into my mind, and a mysterious bond developed between us, shrouded in mutual vulnerability and unspoken truths. In my gut, though, a nagging doubt began to creep in: had I crossed an unspoken line? The basement was replete with shadows that twisted and turned in an unsettling dance, and as I opened the door to leave every session, I felt as if I was stepping into a realm that was both captivating and deeply forbidding. One week, as Drew recounted a particularly harrowing tale about a character of his creation that mirrored his struggles, his energy shifted. There was something in his eyes then, a flicker, maybe of madness or sheer genius, it was hard to tell. I found myself holding my breath, sensing that I had stumbled into a fracture of his soul I wasn't fully prepared for. He mentioned a night he felt compelled to protect himself, drawn into a world where he blurred the lines between fiction and reality. He spoke of the basement in such vivid detail that I almost believed it concealed a world of its own. The conversation lingered like an echo in my mind, unsettling and captivating, and as we closed our session, he handed me a yellowed piece of paper filled with scrawled notes and sketches. "It's a character chart for my next story," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "But it's more than that, it's about me." I felt like a voyeur peering at the fragile flaps of his psyche exposed, and I saw visions of that basement, full of shadows, solace, and maybe something sinister, a vessel for both creativity and torment. In the days that followed, I found myself lost in thought about the stories he told and the meanings hidden beneath his words. One rainy evening, driven by impulse, I decided to venture to his home once more, convinced to understand the space that shaped Drew. As I approached the house, its haunted facade loomed in the dim light, the cracks in the walls seemed to mirror the fractures within the man I had been trying to help. I knocked nervously, and his mother opened the door with a distant look in her eyes, as if too lost in her own thoughts to notice my presence. She led me down to the basement without a word, and once again, I was swept into that dim world filled with shadows and silence. Drew was seated exactly where I'd last seen him, yet there was an air of something different, a thick silence that hung between us like a taut string about to break. He offered me the chair, but I hesitated, suddenly aware that the weight of the room had shifted. "How did you even know to come here?" he asked, his tone low, almost cautious. I explained my worry, my need to understand him better, but the moment my voice faltered, I felt the unease ripple through the space. Something was wrong. That paper he'd handed me was not merely character sketches, they were intricate maps, ones I had overlooked. I leaned closer, trying to absorb every detail, my heart racing as I realized they depicted not just his stories but a labyrinth that mirrored his mind, a prison where his fears came to life. "Drew," I began, my voice quaking, "is there something else you need to share?" He looked up then, his eyes wide as if a veil had been lifted, revealing something buried deep. "I was trying to escape it," he confessed, his hand shaking slightly. "The basement, my mind, it's all the same." And there it was, the roots of his anxiety twisted into the mere act of climbing stairs, as if the very act of going beyond those four walls would unravel the stories he encapsulated. The moment we stood there, surrounded by the artifacts of his life, I realized I was standing at the precipice of something profound. I couldn't help but feel that we had both stepped into a world where compassion danced with darkness, where understanding intertwined with fear. I left that night, my mind racing with thoughts of our conversation, infuriated with myself. I had come seeking answers but found more questions, knots of confusion wrapping deeper around my heart. In the weeks that followed, our sessions transformed. I learned as much from him as he from me. I began to see that the basement was not just a physical space but a realm for healing, a canvas for his creativity and his pain, pushing me deeper into my own fears about boundaries and the nature of care. As I continued to support him in constructing bridges back to the wider world, I realized that sometimes from the deepest shadows, creativity can bloom. What initially seemed a prison became a place of liberation in Drew's mind. Drew eventually moved out of that basement, transitioning into his own apartment, but he never fully left that space behind. Occasionally, I find a bolt of vivid inspiration in his stories. They resonate in me like echoes of a song forgotten. The basement was an invitation to ponder how darkness and light can coalesce, shaping our narratives in ways we might never anticipate. Months later, I returned for one last session, filled with pride and bittersweet nostalgia. As we closed the door behind us, I realized we had woven a tapestry of healing from the threads of his fears. Drew offered me a handwritten letter before I left, expressing thanks that resonated with the warmth shared in those moments, leaving me with a heart full of wonder for the stories that define us. I don't know if I'll ever truly untangle the threads of our journey, but maybe, just maybe, those tales will continue to twist and turn through the shadows, guiding others home. The basement may have held its secrets, but our shared journey had birthed an unexpected friendship, reminding me that healing often blooms in the unlikeliest of places. And as I walked away, I felt an odd sense of closure, both for him and for myself, marveling at how connections can shift the boundaries of understanding. Somehow, through all the chaos, a sense of hope emerged. Life moves forward, often in the quietest of ways, from the shadows of our deepest fears. As I stepped out of that dimly lit basement for the last time, the scent of damp earth and stale memories clung to my clothes, a reminder of all that had transpired within the confines of those four walls. The late afternoon sun poured down, warm and inviting, contrasting sharply with the chill of the basement I'd just emerged from. It felt surreal, leaving behind a world that had unfolded so intricately, yet contained within such a compact space. I glanced back at the windowless facade, wondering how many secrets it still held, and how many more stories could be carved from its shadowy existence. My mind drifted to Jacob, the patient who had inadvertently become my confidant, revealing pieces of himself that seemed more like fragments of a puzzle than complete thoughts. Every session had brought its own revelations, but it was during our last visit that I learned the most about him, not through his words, but through the silence that lingered between us. In that silence, I realized the burden he carried. It wasn't merely the shame of his living conditions or the burden of his past that weighed him down, but the profound loneliness that accompanied his struggle. We had both used therapy to weave a thread of understanding, but perhaps it was more than that. It had become our lifeline in a stormy sea of isolation. It was that very humanity that connected us, more genuine than any scripted psychobabble. Even after our sessions ended, his voice echoed in my thoughts, especially his final words, which felt like both a closure and an invitation. "We're all just stories waiting to be told," he had said, a slight smile breaking the heavy gravity of his usual demeanor. I had left him with an assurance that he would never be alone again in this, that I would carry his story with me, sharing it in my own therapeutic journey. The ride home was filled with a medley of emotions swirling in my chest. I drove through the streets, watching life unfold in front of me, a chaotic dance that seemed so vibrant compared to the stillness I had just left behind. Children rode their bicycles, adults chatted idly on sidewalks, and the sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. It struck me that everyone carried their own hidden struggles, akin to Jacob's. I could see snippets of their own stories passing by. The thought made me reflect on the inevitability of connection and how lives intertwine, often without first realizing our shared burdens. Late that evening, after a simple dinner of takeout sushi, I found myself drawn to my journal, compelled to somehow capture the essence of Jacob's journey. As I scribbled, I felt the weight of each word, the importance of preserving both his vulnerability and strength. I wrote about the laughter we shared, how he revealed fragments of his past in the safety of our sessions, the way he cracked jokes about his ex-girlfriends who lived in the realm of his memories, and how he took each poke of humor as a sliver to cut through his despair. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a release. I was processing his story while weaving it with my own appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit. In the weeks that followed, I kept Jacob in my thoughts more than I had anticipated. Each day seemed to bring a new layer to my understanding of what it meant to acknowledge someone's struggles and how much healing could stem from this acknowledgement. I had begun to reach out, sharing snippets of his journey at professional gatherings, using his anonymity wisely but ensuring his message was clear. Sometimes, hope is found in the most unexpected places, I would say, letting my colleagues know that each patient holds a labyrinth of experiences waiting to be navigated. As I moved through the rhythms of my life, the moments of doubt and worry echoed the earlier feelings of uncertainty I'd felt before meeting Jacob. It made me wonder if I was truly helping others in my practice, or merely dancing around the fringes of healing. But every time I remembered Jacob's laugh, that clear, light laugh that echoed in the depths of despair, I knew then that every patient had their own story, a narrative that deserved to be heard and, at times, passed forward. And so, I learned to walk with a lighter heart, carrying Jacob's strength alongside my professional insights. It was a role we both had unknowingly embraced, I was his watcher and he was my guide. As the boundaries blurred, I realized that each connection I made afterward felt richer, more vibrant, echoing the lessons I had learned in that basement. Months passed, and while I never stopped checking in on him, the visits dwindled. His progress had become a blossoming journey of his own. One evening, just as the winter frost began to settle in, I received a message from him. It was a simple image, a photo of himself standing outside a brightened door, grinning into the camera. I got a place above ground, it read, just a tiny studio with a view of the stars. In that moment, my heart soared with pride. Perhaps the stories held within our shadows weren't meant to disappear, after all. Instead, they became guides, reminding us that, together, we could traverse even the darkest of paths, eventually finding the light. The days that followed that heartfelt message felt lighter, almost as if the chill of winter was merely a backdrop to the warmth blossoming within me. As a therapist, I'd always known that change was possible, but witnessing it firsthand in someone so close to the edge of despair was different. It was invigorating, a testament to the human spirit's resilience. Encouraged by his message, I found myself reflecting on our sessions together, how his quiet determination had sparked something deep within me. He'd shared stories of his past, his childhood and dreams, woven with threads of despair that had once held him captive in that dim basement. Yet somehow, he had begun to untangle those knots, seeking a life beyond the confines of the life he'd constructed. I wanted to see him thrive in his new world, to bask in the glow of his hard-fought freedom. I put aside my research for the day, eager to reach out and arrange a visit. When the day finally came, I felt an unusual mixture of excitement and nervousness, a tangible thrill coursing through my veins as I rang the doorbell of his new place. The tiny studio indeed had a view of the stars, twinkling brilliantly against the velvet night sky, and it felt miraculous to stand in this space that smelled faintly of fresh paint and new beginnings. When he opened the door, the joy in his eyes mirrored the vastness above. "Welcome to my new chapter," he said, his voice steady, yet laced with an undercurrent of disbelief. We spent hours talking about his transition, the spooky stories he had filled our sessions with, and how he was learning to embrace both the light and dark within himself. The vulnerability we shared deepened our bond beautifully. I was no longer just his therapist but a friend, a confidant. As the night wore on, he took me to the small balcony where we could see the stars in all their glory. He pointed to one specific star that shone brighter than the others, calling it his milestone star, a symbol of his journey toward healing. I stood beside him, aware that my heart was expanding with every word we exchanged. It was during those moments of genuine connection, immersed in laughter and shared silence, that I realized how much his struggle had mirrored my own. As a therapist, I had also escaped the shadows, my own fears of inadequacy and the burden of expectations plaguing my mind. Being present with him allowed me to confront my own journey, helping me understand that healing happens collectively as much as it does individually. After what felt like both an eternity and a fleeting instant, the chill of the night crept in, and we both knew it was time for me to go. However, just before I left, he grabbed my arm gently. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "For believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." I felt a lump in my throat but managed to smile, grateful for the role I had played in his transformation. As I headed home, I couldn't shake the feeling of euphoria lifting my spirits higher. I had walked with him through his shadows, and now, I looked forward to witnessing the glow of his newfound hope light up his world. Not long after, I received another message from him. "I feel like I can take on anything now," he shared, mixed with pictures of him smiling with new friends in a local cafe. I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming pride swell within me. But as the weeks unfolded, I realized that there was still a lot of work to be done, not on his part, but on mine. I began to understand that sharing my own struggles could help others, just as I had seen him blossoming without the constraints of his past fears. And as winter melted into a warmer spring, I started to pen my own stories, some connected to my journey as a therapist, others reflecting my personal challenges. I found an unexpected community online, and in sharing, I diminished the power of those shadows that often tried to creep back in. While he stepped into life above ground, I was taking my own journey into the light. Together, we became beacons of hope, finding solace in our shared vulnerabilities and kindness for each other's pain. As we continued to share updates, our conversations illuminated the understanding that healing didn't have a finish line. It was messy, complex, and defined by moments of triumph and despair, but embracing those moments in our lives could lead not just to personal growth, but also to connection. So, when I reflect back on that basement and the struggles that transpired, I now see it as a sacred ground, one that birthed friendship, understanding, and the profound realization that the stories we carry don't just belong to us, they are threads woven into the fabric of humanity itself, binding us in our shared experiences. And sometimes, just sometimes, they bring us the light we so desperately seek. My father's birthday dinner was supposed to be a joyous occasion, a celebration filled with laughter and shared memories, but as I sat there, the weight of unresolved grief rested heavily on my chest. It's funny how the three of us, my dad, my sister Sarah, and I, had always formed a tight-knit unit, yet recent events had begun to fracture that bond. Just 6 months had passed since I suffered a miscarriage, a time when my world turned gray, where joy felt like a distant memory, and the unwavering support I had hoped for from my family seemed, at best, insufficient. I had spent weeks preparing myself for this dinner, eager to distract my mind and feel a sense of normalcy again, but a knot began to twist in my stomach as soon as we arrived at the quaint little restaurant my dad loved. The walls were decorated with photographs from his past birthdays, capturing moments of bliss that now felt unbearably distant. As our waiter brought over the first round of drinks, I inhaled deeply, trying to soak in the laughter of others at nearby tables, the clinking of glasses ringing like a soft melody in my ears. My dad, with his warm eyes twinkling, regaled us with stories from his youth, tales of cross-country road trips and shenanigans with friends. I smiled and took sips of my wine, cherishing the moments of levity he brought, yet shadows loomed in my heart, blossoming with each passing minute. That's when I heard it, a quiet voice carrying through the room, sharp enough to slice through the cheerful hum of conversation. Sarah, seated just across from me, casually remarked to her partner, "Well, at least Mom didn't have to deal with a tiny grave this year." The words dropped heavily into the air, and for a moment, the world around me faded. My heart raced, and my fingers gripped the edge of the table as dread washed over me like bitter cold water. How could she say something so callous? The hurt of my loss bubbled up, intertwining with a complex blend of anger and disbelief. I had always considered Sarah my closest confidant, but now she felt like a stranger, one who didn't comprehend the weight of what I had been through or the sensitivity required when discussing grief. It took all my strength to maintain a facade of composure, but each shallow breath hinted at the storm brewing within me. The entire dinner suddenly felt unbearable, my father's laughter ringing hollow as myriad thoughts cascaded through my mind. I felt the familiar urge to flee, to escape the suffocating reality of my sister's insensitivity. Finally, unable to bear it any longer and desperate to shield myself from any further emotional assault, I stood up, excusing myself with a shaky voice. My dad's laughter dimmed, and an uneasy silence crept in as he looked up, confusion clouding his features. I hurried toward the restroom, each step feeling like an avalanche of regret crashing down on me, for leaving, for how my sister could be so ignorant of my pain, for what was supposed to be a celebration of my father's life morphing into a spotlight on my loss. Once inside the small, dimly lit restroom, I stared at my reflection in the mirror, trying to decipher the woman looking back. Anger flared like wildfire, and I told myself I was justified to feel this way. I reached for my phone, contemplating sending a message to my sister, maybe to explain how her comment had tangled my heart in knots. But each time I typed a word, it felt inadequate, like I was fumbling to convey a deep sadness that she may never understand. I left the restaurant, heart aching and burdened, and as I sat alone in my car, the muffled sounds of the joyful gathering faded into the night. I ruminated over my sister's words, wondering if I had truly overreacted. I drove home in silence, clutching the steering wheel tight, the road ahead blurring through tears. I tried to keep at bay. It wasn't until I got home that I found a sliver of calmness, the weight of the day beginning to lift, and I reflected on the necessity of self-care amidst the chaos. Maybe my response to Sarah was not just about her comment, it was my silent plea for recognition of my pain, a desperate call for empathy that I longed for, yet struggled to express. Weeks passed, and I hesitated, swirling in miscommunication and confusion. Then one quiet afternoon, I finally decided to reach out to Sarah. I texted her, opening the doors for a conversation that would lead us into fragile territory. To my surprise, she responded almost immediately, expressing her own vulnerability. Sarah confessed she had been scared to address my loss, unsure of how to support me, fearing she would say the wrong thing. In turn, I explained how her thoughtless comment had sent me spiraling, how grief could feel isolating, especially in the walls built between family. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Instead, it transformed into a delicate stitch, communication slowly weaving our hearts back together. We realized we had been struggling at opposite ends of the same spectrum, needing each other without knowing how to reach out. As for our father's birthday, I returned to our family dinners, hesitant yet hopeful, ready to make new memories, learning the ebb and flow of grief and joy intertwined. It wouldn't always be easy, but perhaps through understanding, even those heavy ties could strengthen our bond. A few months later, we even planned a gathering to honor my lost baby, a gentle way for us all to acknowledge the fragility of life together. It wasn't just about acknowledging my hurt anymore, it became a shared experience that drew us closer, nurturing the bond we once thought lost. This whole experience taught me a powerful lesson about the intricacies of grief. We can be both hurt and hurting without meaning to, and sometimes the simplest misstep can lead to the most profound realizations. In the end, we came to understand that healing is a journey best walked together, even when the path may be a bit rocky. As the weeks rolled on, my family and I began to reshape the focus of our gatherings, infusing them with stories about the loved ones we had lost and celebrating the lives we still had. Each meeting became a chapter in our collective healing, and slowly, we found joy in shared laughter and nostalgic recollections, all while allowing room for tears when they surfaced. It felt surreal at times, navigating the delicate balance between joy and sorrow. My sister would often reminisce about growing up, cracking jokes about our childhood antics, and I would join in, laughing until I forgot about the heavy ache nestled within my heart. Yet, with every joke, I was acutely aware of an underlying tension that lingered. Our grief was raw, and though we had found a semblance of healing, there were still unspoken words tethered to our experiences. One evening, after what had been a particularly lovely dinner filled with good food and laughter, I noticed my sister staring out the window, her brow furrowed in a way that suggested a silent battle was happening inside her. It was a moment of connection lost in translation, and somehow I knew that she was wrestling with her own guilt, her own questions about our shared experience of loss. Taking a deep breath, I asked her what was on her mind, and she hesitated before her voice came out as merely a whisper. "I can't believe how different life feels now. Do you think we'll ever get back to normal?" As she looked at me, vulnerability flickering in her eyes, I recognized the fear she held, fear that our family would remain fractured, struggling beneath the weight of absence. I reached for her hand, a simple gesture meant to convey solidarity, signaling that the pathway to normal was no longer our goal. Together, we were redefining what our family meant. In the days that followed, we made it a point to engage in small but meaningful rituals. We repurposed anniversaries of our losses into days of gratitude, where we would sit together, perhaps with a candle lit or a favorite photo framed between us, and recount stories of our loved ones, mirthful tales mixed with those easier to swallow that were steeped in love. My sister opened up more, sharing her own struggles with guilt and regret, angles of grief I hadn't seen before. Each conversation gradually eroded the walls we had built around our hearts. We remembered not just those who had left us but also acknowledged our shared humanity and the heavy burden it bore. Healing often felt like 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but each shared moment brought us closer to the heart of what it meant to be family. My father, who had been notably quiet after my loss, appeared to appreciate this newfound dynamic, often chiming in with his own stories that nurtured the laughter in our home once again. He became a stalwart foundation beneath our feet, always encouraging us to lean on him when the weight of our sorrow became too heavy to bear alone. I learned that he, too, was navigating his grief in his own way, the quiet moments of reflection weaving together a narrative of strength and vulnerability that inspired me to keep pushing forward. As spring began to emerge with its floral blooms, glimmers of hope sparkled amidst our healing. I had always held the belief that moments of shared vulnerability could bind us closer together, and my experience had only reinforced that notion. The rocky path I had trekked with my sister transformed into vibrant hues of compassion. However, it wasn't until one particular afternoon, while we were sipping coffee on the porch, that I felt we had truly turned a corner. "You know," my sister said, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her cup, "I think about the baby often. I still grieve, but it feels different now. It's more about remembering than just sadness." Those words settled around us like a gentle breeze, palpable yet comforting as we both acknowledged the bittersweet nature of our memories. By this point, I realized healing wasn't a linear path but rather an intricate tapestry of emotions, perspectives, and connections. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, casting hues of gold across the landscape, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for where we were. This persistent journey teased out the best of us, the lessons learned, the love rekindled, and bonds fortified through shared experiences of grief and love. Looking back now, I understand that acknowledging our individual and collective hurt was just the beginning. It was essential to honor those we lost, yet it was equally pivotal to foster life in our own hearts while doing so. As I reflect on my journey, I find comfort in knowing that while the scars may never completely fade, they have transformed into marks of love, reminders of life's fragility that allowed us to grow as individuals and as a family. Healing becomes a narrative constantly rewritten, just as our love continues to bloom, bright and enduring, a cycle of remembrance and connection that honors not just the lost but also those still here, cherishing every moment we share together. Update: a few months later, when the fall leaves began to blanket the ground, my sister and I found ourselves volunteering at a local charity that supported families who had experienced loss. We thought perhaps we could bring some comfort to others navigating similar paths, and in doing so, strengthened our bond even further. Each story shared was a reminder of our resilience, proving that together, we were not only bereaved but beautifully alive, creating new pages for the chapters that lay ahead. The crisp air of autumn wrapped around us like a soft blanket as I walked alongside my sister, Emma, through the bustling community center. The scent of cinnamon and nutmeg wafted from the nearby kitchen, where volunteers were preparing a feast for the families we hoped to support. I looked at Emma, her hair dancing in the light breeze, and felt a warmth blossom in my heart. It was hard to believe how much had changed since that fateful birthday dinner, where everything had unraveled in a flash of pain and misunderstanding. The air felt lighter now, like the weight of grief had transformed into something we could carry together. Volunteering became a sacred ritual for us, not just a service to others, but a space for our own healing. Each week, we would share stories with those who understood our journey, laughing, crying, and sometimes sitting in contemplative silence. It was in these moments, surrounded by people clinging to hope amidst their sorrow, that we found clarity in our suffering. One evening, after we had helped set up the space for a support group meeting, Emma turned to me with that familiar, mischievous glint in her eye. She suggested we create a special gratitude wall, a place where we could post notes of appreciation for the little things in life, like the laughter shared over coffee, or the warmth of a hug on a cold day. I loved this idea. It felt like we were taking our grief and turning it into something beautiful, offering it to others as a light guiding them through their darkest moments. Days turned into weeks, and soon we were consumed by an unexpected project, a charity event that would not only raise funds but also spread awareness about the often taboo subject of baby loss. Emma and I brainstormed passionately over cups of tea, envisioning a candlelight vigil to honor those we had lost and to celebrate the lives still being lived. I felt a flutter of excitement. It was empowering to take control of our sorrow, to transform it into a platform that could help others. I reached out to potential speakers, healing coaches, and even local artists who had experienced similar losses, inviting them to share their stories and talents. Our community embraced the idea, gathering behind us, and soon what was once a simple concept blossomed into an event that rippled throughout the town. The day of the vigil arrived, and as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, I stood at the forefront of a small group, my heart racing with anticipation. Emma squeezed my hand and smiled, a reassuring gesture that brought me comfort. I spoke openly about our journey, about how we had walked through fire only to emerge stronger, and it felt cathartic to release our story into the world. As candles flickered to life, their gentle flames reflecting in the eyes of those gathered, I felt a profound sense of connection, no longer alone in my sorrow, but part of something much greater. Each shared remembrance, each tear, and each smile became a thread weaving us together, reminding me that grief, while isolating, could also create a community of love and understanding. After the event, as we cleaned up and started to close the space for the night, Emma surprised me with a warm hug. "I didn't think we could turn our sadness into something so beautiful," she said, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "But look at what we did." I nodded, overwhelmed with emotion. The evening had been a testament to resilience, not just ours but of everyone who had braved their own storms. Just when I thought I couldn't feel more connected to Emma, I realized the shared labor of love had sewn us closer, and the fragile harmony we had nurtured gave me hope with deep, unwavering roots. As the days faded into the past, I sometimes found myself reflecting quietly in my room, on the journey that had led me to this moment. It was strange how the air around us seemed to shimmer now, imbued with a sense of possibility and healing. I understood now that while the loss would always be a part of me, it no longer defined my narrative. Instead, it underscored my resilience and illuminated the importance of love and community. Update: a few months later, as winter cloaked the world in white, I received a letter from one of the families we had helped through the charity event. The mother expressed gratitude so heartfelt it felt as though she had reached into my chest to tug at my heartstrings. She informed me that they named their newborn daughter after the baby I had lost. Somehow, those words wove through my grief and into a new, hopeful chapter. I realized that I, too, was creating life anew, forging connections that honored the past while celebrating the present. It brought me comfort to know that even amid loss, love was still growing, binding us all in a beautiful tapestry of remembrance and hope. And so, as the world outside darkened early, I wrapped myself in a blanket of warmth and possibility, letting sleep find me with a heart full of love, knowing that together with Emma, we were brightening the path for others, and ourselves, in this ever-evolving journey of life. I almost quit my job today, and it had nothing to do with the relentless paperwork or the beleaguered patients lined up outside the clinic. I'm a nurse practitioner, and my days usually blur together in an endless cycle of exams and prescriptions, but this day felt different, like the calm before a storm. I was looking forward to my afternoon shift, a solid block of time free from the morning rush, just me, the soothing hum of the fluorescent lights, and the comforting scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. That's when Lily walked in. She was around my age, maybe a bit younger, and her vibrant green hair was styled in a chaotic bun that seemed to echo her energy. I'd heard whispers of her around the clinic, the one with the unusual case. For someone who dealt with anxiety and depression, she managed to light up the dreary waiting room with her infectious grin, but it quickly faded when I called her name. There was something haunting lurking in the depths of her eyes, a slight tremor in her hands that didn't match her bright facade. As she settled into the examination room, the atmosphere shifted. I asked the usual questions, how she'd been feeling, any changes in medication, and why she sought help today. Instead of the typical responses, though, she began to tell me about the voices. They were quiet at first, just murmurs that danced at the edge of her hearing. But lately? They'd grown louder, insisting she was being watched by someone rather sinister. My heart sank into my stomach. HIPAA exists for a reason, protecting both patient privacy and our sanity, but as she continued, something tugged on my conscience. She said her family didn't believe her and, much worse, that they had given up on trying to help her. It's as if they'd rather pretend I don't exist at all, she said, her voice trembling. I couldn't fathom the depth of that pain, the isolation. I could see the flicker of desperation in her eyes, the yearning for validation. I tried to reassure her, encouraging her to seek support from professionals who could offer therapy and possibly medication adjustments, but she insisted that wasn't enough. The voices had sharpened their focus, demanding she prove her existence in a way that threatened her well-being. I felt my heart race as her story unfolded, a pit forming deep within me. It was getting harder to maintain my professionalism. I knew I shouldn't share my thoughts, my personal experiences as a fellow human who'd felt unseen at times, but a voice in my mind urged me to try. Sometimes, the pressure of feeling invisible can become unbearable, I admitted, keeping my tone steady. But it's crucial to reach out to those who care for you. She hesitated, her expression riddled with conflicted emotions. But what if I don't matter to anyone? She whispered. For a moment, I felt like I had been punched in the gut. Many people felt that way at some point, including myself. I wanted to reach across the space between us, to take her hand and reassure her that she mattered. But I couldn't, not without breaching that invisible line that kept patients and healthcare providers apart. I took a deep breath, the weight of the conversation settling heavily on my shoulders. As she left the room, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I was haunted by her words, her pain, and the burdens I couldn't ease for her. It felt wrong not to do more, to walk away and let someone so desperate wander alone into the world, especially with her fragile mental state. That night, I couldn't shake the experience, replaying her words over and over. I couldn't help but reflect on the strength of connection that often eludes us in our professional roles. I wondered if I had neglected that part of my oath, to care as a human as well as a practitioner. Maybe it was my own past experiences intertwined with her pain, but when I clocked in the next day, I resolved to change my approach. I wanted to find ways to connect my patients with support systems that made them feel valid, to foster a space where they could share openly. Perhaps I couldn't reach out in the fullest sense, but I could certainly lead them to resources that would prove that they mattered. As I worked on crafting a new referral brochure for mental wellness services within the clinic that day, I felt a sense of purpose pulsating within me. And in a way, through focusing on Lily's needs, I began healing some fragments of my own past. If nothing else, I hoped she would find a voice she could trust, a lifeline to bridge the gaps left by those who'd turned away. Months passed, and every so often, I would see Lily's name on the schedule. Each encounter felt like a new chapter. On one visit, I was pleased to see she looked better, the shadows under her eyes had lifted slightly, replaced by a flicker of hope in her voice. "You were right," she said, smiling as she unfolded the complexities of her therapy sessions and newfound support group. I found my voice. And it turns out, I do matter. In that moment, a warmth spread through my chest, a confirmation that sometimes the smallest acts of reaching out can ignite a change profound enough to alter lives. Lily didn't have to bear her burdens alone anymore, and neither did I. I realized then that being a caregiver wasn't just about the prescriptions or the examinations. Sometimes, it was about sharing pieces of ourselves to help others stitch together their narratives, reminding them that they are not invisible nor expendable. In sharing our stories, we learn to redefine connections and uplift each other beyond the stigmas that might bind us. As I took in these thoughts, I glanced over at Lily, her apprehensive expression softening as she leaned back in the chair, visibly more at ease. The sterile white walls of my office, which usually echoed with the coldness of clinical detachment, seemed to blossom with warmth. There was something powerful unfolding between us, a shared vulnerability that felt like the roots of a plant intertwining beneath the surface, hidden yet vital. Somehow, this realization shifted something within me as well. I was no longer just a healthcare provider, I was both a listener and a participant in an unfolding human experience. However, the day grew darker as I remembered the nagging fears that had haunted me since I became a therapist. My mind wandered back to the unwritten rules of my profession. The protocols of HIPAA, with their stringent regulations, often loomed in the background like a shadow, reminding me that I must tread carefully lest I lose not only my career but also the trust of my patients. What if I stepped over a line with Lily? What if sharing even the slightest piece of my life led to a breach of confidentiality? I was supposed to be the one providing support, not dragging us both into murky waters where boundaries blurred. The anxiety gnawed at me, threading a mixture of elation and trepidation through my chest. To prevent the encroaching worries from spiraling, I redirected the conversation, asking her about her own experiences. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face before she divulged her first encounters with therapy. As she recounted her journey through various milestones, each wrought with its own struggles and victories, a sense of connection deepened. There was an innate comfort in the way our conversation flowed, a gentle give and take that felt as gratifying as it was cathartic. Every shared word knitted our beings closer together, yet in my quieter moments, the toll of my own thoughts lingered like a muted refrain in the background. As the session drew to a close, we exchanged pleasantries, but I sensed an unspoken bond tethered between us, stronger than the unyielding protocols of my profession. Lily had opened up in ways I never anticipated, allowing me to glimpse glorious vulnerabilities within her that reminded me of my own struggles, overwhelming at times, but profoundly human. I made a silent vow to find a way to navigate this connection without falling prey to my own fears. Perhaps, I thought, I could share selectively, using my own experiences to guide but remaining steadfast on the path of professionalism. In the following days, I immersed myself in my work, the rhythm of routine comforting yet occasionally disquieting. Yet, I couldn't shake the memory of that session with Lily. I found myself replaying our conversation over and over, marveling at how two souls braving their respective storms could find solace in shared vulnerabilities. With each passing moment, my initial fears surrounding that session diminished. I felt a resolve taking root. I wanted to work on my boundaries while still holding space for the humanity both Lily and I had uncovered. Finally, I decided that the best way to navigate this delicate situation was not in isolation but together. During our next session, I broached the topic with Lily, underlining the importance of our boundaries yet sharing that vulnerability had proven transformative for both of us. To my relief, she assured me she felt the same sense of community, the relief of companionship. Together, we forged a pact, to be honest about our boundaries while allowing our connections to flourish. The resolution felt simplistic yet significant. It was an unspoken agreement to uphold the integrity of our therapeutic space while celebrating the truth of our shared humanity. With each session that followed, I felt lighter, an odd sense of liberation tethered to my heart. Lily continued to open up in ways that astonished me, and I found myself drawn to her courage, the way she navigated her challenges with such simmering hope. The fear of HIPAA violations dulled in the face of the profound benefits of our connection. It became part of the backdrop of my practice, where I learned to delicately balance my role while still being present, authentic, and, most importantly, human. Reflecting now on that initial trepidation, I feel a newfound appreciation for the journey we've embarked upon, the uncharted waters of vulnerability and the cozy warmth that rises when care meets courage. Amidst the ethical intricacies of my profession, I've found that the essence of caregiving flourishes in honesty, resilience, and shared stories, cementing a beautiful, imperishable bond stretched across what once felt like walls of clinic and distance. After some time, I received a message from Lily. It was brief yet packed with gratitude, a simple, "thank you," expressing how our sessions felt less like a bandage on wounds but rather a seasoned balm for her spirit. I smiled as I read it, my heart lifting again at the thought that we both had navigated this path together, reminding me that sometimes, in the delicate dance of healing, the lines can blur in the most beautiful ways. Life was about bridging gaps, and our bond, though formed in a therapeutic context, had transformed into a cherished connection that I never could have forged alone. And so I realized, in the unpredictable landscape of being a caregiver, it is the humanity we share, the light and shadows, that helps us grow. As I reflected on that turning point between us, I found myself sitting in my small office, a cozy nook piled high with medical textbooks and framed reminders of why I chose this path in the first place. The walls, painted a calming shade of blue, felt more comforting than sterile as they witnessed the evolution of our relationship, a relationship I had once thought was strictly professional now unfolding into something rich and redemptive. I recalled the countless hours I spent with Lily, sifting through her complexities and the layers of stories she carried like old baggage. Each session had been a dance of vulnerability, her heart laid bare against the backdrop of my clinical paperwork and diagnostic goals. I had come to realize that through her own depths of despair, a flicker of resilience shone, and in turn, she was illuminating the way for me, a reminder of the intrinsic connection that binds us all as we navigate our personal labyrinths. But with joy comes uncertainty, and as thrilled as I was to forge this bond, I knew I had to tread carefully. There were boundaries to consider, ethics to uphold, particularly with someone whose path had been riddled with trauma and heartache. I pondered the intricacies of our conversations and wondered how I could continue to support her while avoiding the slippery slope of overreach. Amidst my thoughts, the reality was the challenging nature of navigating a caregiver's role, enhancing lives and offering insights without overstepping that invisible line, one that could easily blur. Soon, our next session arrived, a Wednesday that marked a full month since she had first come to see me. I prepared with mixed emotions, excitement stitched with the shadows of apprehension. As I entered the room, a familiar sight warmed my heart. Lily was already seated, her hands twirling a small silver locket, a talisman of sorts that had clearly become her anchor. "I've been thinking about what you said last time," she began, her voice steady, yet with a softness that carried an underlying vulnerability. "About sharing pieces of ourselves." Her words unfurled like blossoms in spring. Our conversation deepened and broadened in ways that felt profound yet so natural. She spoke of benevolent ghosts from her past, former friends who had fallen away, consumed by their own battles, and how their absence left scars she sometimes could not articulate. I listened intently, leaning forward, as time seemed to slip away like sand through fingers. What followed was a gentle volley of stories, her laughter sparking light moments, while the shadows of sorrow lurked just behind the edges, grounding her narrative. A part of me knew that I had to reveal a bit of my own past, a thread of vulnerability to encourage her narrative to grow. I shared tales of my early days in this field, moments of crippling self-doubt when my idealism collided with the stark realities of human pain. I spoke of patients whose stories had etched themselves into the tapestry of my soul, shaping my resolve and orientation. A fierce yet fragile connection blossomed in that exchange, making our struggles feel lighter, almost woven into each other's fabric of experience in a way that transcended clinical boundaries. As weeks drifted on, I felt us move through those uncharted waters, each session filled with dimensions that I had long ago yearned for in this profession, a partnership of healing in its purest form. I was filled with hope, camaraderie, and yet, a tinge of fear. It was the fear of losing her to the world's cruel indifference or the possibility of outing her vulnerabilities to another who would not understand. The emotional weight was palpable, but we thrived in our candid spaces, lifting each other. Sometimes I found it a bit too exhilarating and overwhelming, yet necessary. Then one day, it happened. Lily mentioned her desire to take a step further, exploring creative outlets to channel her feelings. She spoke of wanting to write a blog, to immortalize her battles and stir others who might feel lost. My heart raced, not out of fear, but sheer exhilaration at the thought of her blossoming beyond the confines of our sessions. Yet, the notion struck a dual chord. What if revealing those thoughts to the world puts you at risk? I hesitated. But she countered with a quiet steeliness that took me aback. "It's my story, and I deserve to tell it how I want." And she paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. It was a moment that whispered volumes, and I felt our roles reverse in that heartbeat. I began to see her not just as a patient in need of care, but as a beacon of strength, reaffirming that healing was a shared journey, bringing us back, full circle, to where we started, the necessity of weaving our lives together into something magnificent. With that revelation, I let go of my fears, recognizing that sometimes a pathway to healing lay in the raw honesty of our experiences. I embarked on encouraging her, offering my support and guidance while she traversed this new creative venture. As she crafted her first post, I felt a rush of gratitude. By helping her navigate the uncharted waters of sharing, I was also embracing my fears and reaffirming my purpose. In that light, I learned and grew right alongside her. And suddenly, the once stern lines of caregiver and patient blurred in the most beautiful, validating way. As days turned to weeks, I watched her transform into a confident storyteller, her words wrapping around other seekers of solace as if crafting a communal blanket in which they could huddle. The small canvas of our original therapeutic room became a vibrant tapestry stitched with lifelike colors reflecting joy and sorrow, laughter and tears. It drew others in, creating bonds of understanding and shared struggles. One day, while uploading her latest blog post, she reached out to me with dazzling excitement. A 2-minute read turned into an avalanche of uplifting responses. It was then that I began to fully grasp the magnitude of our connection. I felt closer to Lily than I had to anyone in a long time, and as the lines of our roles shifted, I found comfort in the dance we had created together. Then, as the seasons changed, so did our meetings. We held space together, celebrated milestones, and cried over setbacks, all part of a story that was still unfolding. Each session became a symphony of shared moments, navigating the unpredictable landscape together, replete with laughter, tears, and the beauty of newfound openness. With each step, I grew more certain in my belief that this journey was reciprocal. We were learners, healers, companions, and in the end, we were simply two souls forging ahead, one day at a time. As I look back on that journey, I remember it as a paradox, a blend of vulnerability wrapped in strength. I thought I would make Lily stronger, but in turn, she helped me reclaim parts of myself that I had buried under the weight of duty and expectation. In embracing her fragility while celebrating her resolve, I became entwined in the very essence of caregiving, a shared spirit where the act of healing became about all of us, far beyond the mere confines of an office. I never once regretted that I hadn't quit. Instead, I found a path not only for her but for myself, and this, I realized, was precisely what I was meant to do. Update: it's been 6 months since I last wrote this account, and I felt compelled to share a final chapter. Lily's blog had taken off. She was invited onto a platform to speak about her experiences, and through it all, her voice, our voice, has become a beacon for others struggling in shadows. Last week, we hosted a community gathering, bringing people together to share their stories face to face in a celebration of resilience. Something magical happened. In seeing the way our paths converged with others, I realized I wasn't just a caregiver, I was a part of something much larger than myself. We weren't alone anymore, and in stepping away from the boundaries I once feared, I learned that being human means opening ourselves up to the tapestry of lives we weave together, brightened by the stories we share. I never imagined my life could pivot so dramatically over something as mundane as a locked door, but here I am, recounting the events of that fateful evening with a sense of incredulity that still lingers. My name is Alex, an ordinary 30-something guy with a desk job and a comfortable little home nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. I've always prided myself on being a conscientious husband, but like everyone else, I have my moments of negligence, and perhaps it was a combination of those moments that set this all in motion. It was a Thursday night, typical in every way, until I caught a glimpse of my wife, Laura, standing by the front door, her expression a mixture of frustration and disbelief, the kind that made my chest tighten in an instant. She was holding the doorknob, twisting it back and forth while I was half awake from a cozy couch nap, remnants of my evening routine still fresh in my mind, the warm glow of the TV, a snack bowl emptied, and the soft hum of the world outside. Laura asked me, with a sting of disappointment, if I had checked the lock after she'd gone to bed, and as I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, I realized I had utterly spaced on that detail, again. I shrugged it off at first, making casual remarks about how I trust our neighborhood and how we had lived there for years without incident. But in the back of my mind, I felt a creeping unease as I watched her react, her brow furrowed as she responded, "It's not about trusting the neighborhood, Alex. It's about being safe." A part of me wanted to laugh it away, to dismiss her concerns as overreactions like I once did during our years together, but as she continued to express her frustration, I felt a knot forming in my stomach, linking back to my own lack of accountability. Was I really that oblivious? It became clear that this situation was a metaphorical lock waiting to be clicked open, revealing deeper issues that may have long since festered beneath our shared surface. Days passed, and the conversation wafted in and out of my mind, my interactions with Laura feeling increasingly stifled like the air on a humid summer day. I'd watch her move through the house, her movement subtle yet heavy with a sense of grounded concern, the way a cloud hangs low and suspenseful, threatening rain. I noticed the little things, the way she double-checked the locks on the windows during the day, her growing habit of closing the blinds earlier than usual, her hesitance to walk to the mailbox alone. The peaceful rhythms of our life together felt interrupted as I tried to ignore the gnawing sensation at the back of my mind. The evening we normally spent side by side on the couch morphed into quiet, fragmented moments filled with awkward silences. It all came to a head one night when I returned home later than usual after meeting some friends for dinner. There she stood in the living room, awaiting my arrival like a lighthouse beacon cutting through the fog, arms crossed with a stern look on her face that I'd never seen aimed directly at me. I opened my mouth to greet her, but the words caught in my throat. I could sense it was more than just the locked door. "Did you even check the door?" Her voice was steady but tinged with a puncturing edge that stung more than I cared to admit. I hesitated, the silence stretching into a chasm. "No, I didn't," I finally admitted, the echo of those words reverberating through the room like a confession made under duress. "I just assumed you had it." It felt pathetic, my own excuse evaporating into the atmosphere. My stomach twisted again, I could see pain flickering through her eyes, an emotion beyond mere frustration, a sense of betrayal, of being let down by me, the one person she should be able to count on. Suddenly, it struck me, it wasn't just about the door, it was about trust, about dependence, about the fragile threads that held together our relationship. I realized how much she leaned on me, expected me to be her rock, and I had neglected even the simplest thread keeping our safety intact. As we sat on the couch that night, the air thick with unspoken words and fragile hopes, I squeezed her hand and spoke softly, "I'm sorry. I thought I was being rational, but I wasn't being responsible. I promised to do better, to pay attention, to make you feel safe, not just when it's convenient for me." She responded by tracing her fingers along my palm, the tension easing as the minutes passed. The silence transformed from oppressive to contemplative, and we found ourselves deep in conversation, navigating our fears, our trust, and the small yet pressing details of our shared lives. As the moonlight spilled through the window, I understood that the lock was just a symptom of a deeper issue, my unpredictability and her need for assurance. Weeks later, our routines began to shift. I made it a point to verify every lock, not just for Laura, but as a symbol of my commitment to being present and responsible. The atmosphere in our home brightened, she smiled more, and we dove into rebuilding that connective thread, one soft conversation, one warm touch at a time. Reflection filled those quiet moments. We'd sit together on the couch, and as she leaned against me, I felt a new kind of peace emerging from our shared vulnerability. And so, in the spirit of Reddit tradition and as a reflection of this journey, I find it important to add this update. The evening I thought we were heading toward a rift transformed instead into an awakening. It wasn't just about the door or even the act of locking it. It became a way to openly articulate our needs, desires, and fears. I learned that perhaps it wasn't an AITA situation at all. Perhaps, instead, it was AITA, am I trying to learn? Because in that small, seemingly trivial episode, I discovered something profound about love, trust, and the importance of the little things in creating a safe harbor we could always come home to. The door has never been left unlocked. Again, and neither have our hearts. As the weeks rolled into months following our profound conversation about the door, I found myself reflecting on the subtle transformations in our relationship. It became a game of sorts, where each night, as I prepared to settle into bed, I would gently remind Lucy to double-check the lock, teasing her playfully about my newfound security obsession. I could feel the fortress we were building, not merely around our home but within each other, grow stronger and stronger. It was surprising how such a simple act could blossom into moments filled with tenderness and laughter, a little more anticipation before sleep took us. We began establishing new rituals, little habits that weren't mandated by duty but born out of a desire to nurture our partnership. Each evening concluded with us sharing a cup of tea on the porch, watching the day melt into night, with the faint sounds of crickets filling the air, a gentle reminder that life outside continued in a rhythm we were beginning to appreciate together. I started to look at our relationship with a new lens, where open communication became our foundation, and vulnerability, once a source of anxiety, transformed into our shared strength. I cherished those confiding moments with Lucy, preparing dinner together and laughing over burnt bread, the usual small talk evolving into deeper discussions about our hopes for the future. Conversations flowed like sacred threads binding us closer, so much so that I almost forgot what it felt like to walk that thin line of misunderstanding that we had been teetering on prior. It amazed me how our vulnerabilities morphed into stepping stones, carving pathways to rediscover the intricacies of each other's souls, learning, once again, what made us who we were. There were times, of course, where we stumbled. There were disagreements around financial decisions or the occasional miscommunication that prompted a surge of frustration, but even then, instead of retreating into silent resentments, we breathed, discussed, and gently nudged each other toward a healthier understanding. I realized that those moments are just as essential as the laughter-filled ones. They rounded us out. However, the true test of this new dynamic came on a chilly autumn night. The air bit fiercely against our cheeks, and the neighbors' laughter echoed through the street, reminding me of the warmth radiating from our home. Lucy and I were cozied up on the couch, engrossed in a movie, when suddenly an urgent knocking interrupted the cozy ambience. My heart raced. Was it a stranger? A lost traveler? That familiar feeling of anxiety tugged at my chest as I glanced at Lucy, who only nodded, encouraging me to check the door. It felt as if time had slowed. I walked to the front door, the wooden floor creaking beneath my weight, feeling every heartbeat pulsing in my ears. Peering through the peephole, I was met with a young girl, maybe 10 years old, shivering and teary-eyed. I opened the door just enough to speak. "Hey there, are you all right?" Her face was lost in shadows, but I could make out the tremor of her chin and the way she rubbed her arms together, as if trying to generate warmth. I got lost. Can I call my dad? He's just around the corner." My mind spun. Here I was, in our safe bubble, our haven, facing a potential crisis. A moment of fear tangled with empathy bubbled inside me. It was a test of everything we had learned, our commitment to openness, to addressing fears head-on. "Of course, sweetie, come in," I said, opening the door wider and motioning for her to step inside. As the warmth enveloped her, she glanced back at the darkened street, her eyes wide with uncertainty. I knew that this small act could either shield her further from threats or potentially lead to something more dangerous. Lucy joined us, her nurturing presence illuminating the moment, and we quickly settled into a space of safety and comfort. I reached for my phone, handed it to the girl, and patted her on the shoulder. "Just dial the number you remember. We're right here with you." The girl's hands shook as she dialed, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke to her father. She relaxed slightly upon hearing him say he was on the way, and when she hung up the phone, her relief washed over me, filling the room with a profound quiet that seemed to hold stories of fear and safety in equal measure. When her dad finally arrived, our home transformed again, this time into a sanctuary, a temporary refuge. The girl rushed into her father's arms, and I felt an overwhelming gratitude that we were able to offer even this tiny comfort amidst her disarray. After exchanging pleasantries and ensuring she was safe, the father made it clear how invaluable our kindness was, lighting a small flame of warmth within me. After they left, as Lucy and I settled back down on the couch, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everything in our life together. It suddenly struck me that it wasn't merely about locking the door, it was about being open to the world outside, understanding that the safety and love we built weren't just for ourselves but could spill over into interactions that mattered with everyone around us. The door, once just an entryway to our home, had morphed into a symbol of our commitment to compassion and understanding, not just for each other but for anyone who crossed our threshold. I turned to Lucy, and we exchanged a smile filled with warmth and an unspoken promise that we would always remain open, vulnerable but secure, cautious yet loving, a true masterpiece of coexistence. And in those moments of quiet reflection, surrounded by the fading light of the evening, I finally felt the weight of the world lift just a little, reminding me that love doesn't simply build walls, rather, it constructs bridges that lead us back to humanity, again and again, one gentle reminder, one locked door, at a time. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across our cozy living room, I could feel the gentle hum of evening settling in, the kind that wraps you in a cocoon of comfort. Lucy had lit a few candles, their soft glow flickering in harmony with the settling tranquility of the night. It was a small ritual we had embraced, a moment of unwinding where the chaos of the day seemed to melt away. The warmth of her presence reminded me that we had crafted a safe space together, not just through the physical act of locking the door, but through the emotional openness we had nurtured in our relationship. Pacing softly, I felt grateful for this revelation, how something as simple as a door could serve as a metaphor for our willingness to safeguard one another's vulnerabilities. "Remember that night?" Lucy asked, her voice laced with a gentle nostalgia as she curled up on the couch, her eyes sparkling with memories. The one where we both brainstormed a list of our fears? She chuckled lightly, and I joined in, recalling a time when our insecurities seemed larger than life. We had laughed as we shared everything from mundane anxieties about work to deeper concerns about our relationship. That honest exchange had unknowingly paved the way for our newfound understanding of what it meant to connect, truly connect, beyond surface-level conversations. Yeah, I replied, settling in beside her and draping an arm around her shoulders. It's amazing how vulnerability can turn into strength if we let it. The moment felt precious, the world outside blurring into insignificance as we cocooned ourselves in this intimate bubble of safety. We began to share not just our fears, but our dreams, each whisper more soothing than the last, forming a tapestry of hopes that we would nurture together. I felt a rush of contentment, realizing that each lock I checked, each door I secured, was a commitment, an act of love that transcended fear and doubt. As the bits and pieces of our evening unfolded, conversations sparked like fireworks, our discourse ranging from future vacations we dreamed about to our desire to bring a pet into our home. Lucy was still talking about getting a dog, something I had initially hesitated over, wary of the added responsibility, but the way she spoke, her eyes lighting up at the thought, began to chip away at my resistance. A dog would be more than just an addition to our lives, it would be a shared experience, a reminder of how love could flourish in the little moments, from morning walks to lazy afternoons spent on the couch. With every word exchanged, I felt the door we had just locked moments before transform into one that swung wide open, inviting in a rush of warmth. As the candles flickered gently, casting playful shadows on the walls, I could see what lay ahead of us, a future painted in shades of laughter, compassion, and unwavering support. It was empowering to realize that we weren't just locking away our fears, we were also sealing in our joys, ensuring that nothing could breach the sanctuary we were building together. In time, as the evening wore on and the moon cast a silver glow through our window, I took a moment to breathe deeply and internalize the warmth of this connection we were nurturing. The world outside felt distant, almost irrelevant, as I realized that our relationship had morphed from merely coexisting to truly living, a shared journey where each step was marked by intention and understanding. Have you ever thought about how locking the door is kind of a ritual? I mused aloud, breaking the comfortable silence that had enveloped us like a soft blanket. Lucy nodded, her dark hair catching a glimmer of candlelight. It's the first step we take in closing out the outside world, she said thoughtfully, but it also makes space for us to just be, here, in our little world. It's our way of saying, this is our time. We matter. Yes. I replied, feeling a swell of pride and love. It wasn't just about locking the door, it was about what it symbolized, the commitment to honor our space and each other. The balancing of boundaries and openness that allowed for growth without losing our individuality. I couldn't help but smile, envisioning the dog we might someday share. Next door might be the kids, or the noise of the world, but in this moment, it's just us. As the last flicker of the candles dimmed, I felt a deep reassurance envelope me, a tender acknowledgement that our bond was evolving in ways that were once unimaginable. I snuggled closer to Lucy, feeling the warmth radiating from her, a beacon in the cool night. The locked door wasn't just a safeguard, it was a promise we had made to each other, a vow to always return to the safe harbor we had created. And so, as I closed my eyes and allowed sleep to wash over me, I found solace in the laughter that echoed through the evening and the new dreams we would embrace upon waking. A door locked, yet ajar with possibility, standing as a testament to our journey. And with that, I drifted into sleep, content, loved, and forever learning. The question fluttered through my mind like a moth drawn to the dim light of my living room. It was simple, but the implications loomed heavy on my heart. Am I the asshole for charging my adult children rent? I never imagined this is where I would find myself at 55, standing at the crossroads of nurturing love and harsh reality. My children, Claire and Josh, had both moved back in after college, faced with a tight job market and student loans that loomed like clouds ready to burst. It felt like just yesterday I was sending them off into the world, filled with ambition and dreams, and now the stack of bills, once a distant whisper, was suddenly a roiling shout that demanded to be heard. I loved my children fiercely, but the reality of our situation was different now. My modest home, decorated with family photos that were practically engraved in my heart, was quickly becoming a shared refuge rather than a home. Things shifted, however, when the conversation turned to finances one evening while we surveyed my faded kitchen, once filled with laughter and now littered with remnants of takeout dinners. I broached the subject lightly, almost gingerly, trying to extricate myself from the churning feeling of guilt that wound tightly in my gut. You know, It's not that we can't help each other, I started, but maybe we should think about small contributions for living here. Claire, always the more outspoken of the two, rolled her eyes, casting a glance at Josh, who sat with his head buried in his phone, blissfully unaware. Seriously, Mom? Rent? We're trying to find our footing. She replied, exasperation cutting through her voice like a knife. I felt my heart sink as Josh chimed in, softening the blow with, we're still your kids, you know. Initially, I shrugged off their anger, convincing myself it stemmed from the stress of their own financial burdens, yet the guilt lingered like a shadow. The thought that I might be seen as cold or unloving gnawed at me. My thoughts spiraled, had I failed them by expecting them to contribute to the household? But then, another voice in my head reminded me of the sacrifices I had made. I had worked extra shifts to give them what they needed, and it dawned on me that this was about preparing them for the realities of adulthood, not about making me less of a mother. Still, I wrestled nightly with the decision, my journal filled with poignant reflections on whether love and responsibility could coexist without one overshadowing the other. It was during a heated argument a few days later that it all boiled over, my attempts at calm being met with more resentment. You say you're teaching us, but this feels more like punishment, Claire shouted, tears in her eyes. I held my breath, the weight of her distress settling heavily on my shoulders. In that moment, I realized it wasn't just about money, it was about trust and recognition. I'm not punishing you. I want you both to thrive. I want you to prepare for the world outside these walls, I replied, my voice trembling with emotion. The room became engulfed in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. It was clear I needed to reconsider the way forward. After much soul-searching, I decided to propose a compromise that would allow us to keep our familial bond intact. The very next day, I gathered my children and talked through my thoughts, removing the label of rent and instead framing it as a living contribution, focusing on what they could help with, whether it was chores or a small monthly amount that would go toward shared costs. To my surprise, they listened, the tension in the room gradually ebbing as we discussed our expectations with open hearts. So it's not about just money, right? It's teamwork? Josh asked, his eyes lighting up with understanding. I nodded fervently, relief washing over me like a tidal wave. We moved forward with boundaries but also with a renewed sense of cooperation, and I marveled at the transformation that occurred, realizing we were not simply roommates navigating rent but rather a family redefining our dynamics together. As the weeks turned into months, I discovered that this change not only eased my financial burden but also rekindled a sense of shared purpose among us. Conversations returned to the table, laughter emanated from our shared moments, and in those evenings spent together, it felt as if we were finding our way back, stitching back together what was nearly frayed. The idea of charging them rent became not a source of resentment but a catalyst for deeper connection. In hindsight, I didn't just charge them, I opened the door to joint stewardship of our lives, an adjustment that allowed us to step forward together rather than apart. As for updates, it's been almost a year since the paradigm shift, and I'm heartened to say Claire now has an internship that could lead to a full-time job, while Josh is earning his keep through freelance gigs. They still contribute to household expenses, each month passing me their share with pride, as if each note exchanged is more than just money, but a message that reads, "We've got this, together." And as I sit in the same faded kitchen, watching them grow into the people I always hoped they would be, I realize this journey has taught me as much as it has taught them. Am I the asshole? Perhaps once, but I've come to understand that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that lead to the strongest connections. As I sit in that faded kitchen, sunlight streaming through the sheer curtains, casting soft shadows on the table where we gather for our makeshift family meetings, I reflect on how our home has transformed over the past few months. When Josh and Emily moved in, there was a palpable tension in the air, a mix of expectation and uncertainty. I had been battling my own insecurities and regrets about charging them rent, fearing it would disrupt our bond. Yet, every time I see them, filled with determination, as they balance schoolwork with part-time jobs, I feel an overwhelming sense of pride. Each evening, as we share our meals, the laughter echoes in the corners of the room, wrapping around us like a warm blanket, dispelling any lingering doubt I had initially held about my decision. It had been Josh who first approached me with concern about finances after losing his last full-time job. He spoke earnestly about wanting to contribute more rather than feel like a burden. "I don't want you to struggle because of me," he had said, that familiar spark of responsibility igniting in his eyes. How could I argue with that? Emily followed suit, her spirit equally fired up, insisting that she too wanted to pitch in, to contribute to the household in a way that felt meaningful. It was then that I realized this was about more than just money, it was about empowerment. With the rent agreement in place, I made it abundantly clear that their contributions would be saved toward a future goal, perhaps toward their educational aspirations or an eventual escape of their own, helping to ensure they wouldn't find themselves completely reliant on me once they stepped into the wider world. Each time I handed them a receipt showing their contributions, I would joke, "Look at you, you're practically business owners now." Following those jokes were serious discussions about budgeting and saving. They would listen intently, their eyes bright, eager to absorb the advice, while I shared tales from my own youth, trying to weave in lessons learned as I stumbled through life. Those evenings began to intertwine with deeper conversations about dreams, fears, and the kind of people they envisioned themselves becoming. With every discussion, I could feel our relationship evolving, both as a parent and as individuals seeking to understand one another. One rainy afternoon, however, things took a challenging turn. Emily returned home distraught, her usual spark dulled. "Mom, I don't know if I can continue doing this. It feels like everything is piling on top of me," she admitted, falling onto the couch, her voice strained and defeated. I joined her on the couch, pulling the fuzzy blanket over us as we settled into the silence that accompanied her heavy words. The weight of missed assignments and looming deadlines pressed on her like an ocean wave, and I could see the hope in her eyes flicker momentarily. "What if we adjust a bit? Rent doesn't always have to be paid in full," I offered gently. "Your well-being comes first. It's okay to ask for help." My words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, silence enveloped us before she finally nodded, a small smile breaking through the storm clouds. As the weeks rolled by, we found new rhythms, discussing every tweak and adjustment we made to our agreements candidly. Josh, too, began to share his own struggles more openly, confessing moments of loneliness and his fear of never reaching the ambitions he carried. It was during one of these powerful exchanges that I understood the true essence of decisions made from love. Not only did they learn responsibility, but they also discovered vulnerability and space for genuine dialogue, something I had always longed for us to possess. We emerged stronger as a family, moved forward by empathy and mutual respect, acknowledging our individual journeys without losing sight of our shared path. In this warm cocoon of familiarity and love, I've realized that our home isn't just a physical space, it's a sanctuary carved from our shared experiences, successes, and collective heartaches. The question of whether I was the asshole lingers somewhere in the back of my mind, but it has transformed from a painful inquiry into an echo of a lesson learned. By fostering their independence within the walls of our home, I not only nurtured their growth but also kept the ties of our relationship tightly woven, reminding us all that love doesn't fade in the face of responsibility. Instead, it evolves, deepening in ways I could never have imagined. As I sit here, I can see that it isn't about the money or even the chores, it's about understanding, growth, and creating an environment where we can all be better versions of ourselves together. And while the future is uncertain, a chorus of questions still unanswered, I feel a profound sense of gratitude for this shared journey, knowing that being a parent is less about getting it right all the time and more about navigating every twist and turn with an open heart. Sometimes, I find solace in the thought of letting each of them fly with their own set of wings, ready to embrace whatever the world has in store, while I would remain here, cheering them on from the sidelines, proud of the choices we made together in this home of ours. However, as the weeks passed, I began to experience an unfamiliar unease, a gentle pressure building beneath the surface of our harmonious existence. It started with those quiet moments, sitting alone in my favorite worn-out chair while Josh and Lena collaborated at the kitchen table, their laughter and chatter creating a cozy atmosphere that made my heart swell with pride. Yet, tucked away in the corner of my mind was a prickling doubt, whispering that perhaps I had placed an unnecessary burden on their shoulders. The thoughts started to gnaw at me during sleepless nights, where thoughts raced through my mind like leaves caught in a gust of wind, questioning my decisions and choices. They did, after all, come to me during the pandemic when everything had been uncertain, their lives upended in ways I couldn't fully grasp. I remember my own parents, who had faced such trials with grit and resilience, but never once did they charge me rent. As days turned into weeks, the tight-knit bond we shared sometimes felt like it stood on shaky ground. I tried to brush it off, focusing on the joy of our routines, breakfast-making competitions, game nights peppered with sarcasm and laughter. And those afternoons when I would find them lost in their respective worlds, creativity bursting from them like blooming wildflowers. But the shadows of my thoughts lingered, lingering as a subtle reminder that their growing independence came with its own set of fears. One night, after an especially hectic day, I was cleaning up the remnants of dinner, overwhelmed by a sudden wave of clarity. I turned to them and, in a voice that quivered with a mix of uncertainty and resolve, asked if they felt the same way I did. To my surprise, their expressions turned serious, and I felt as if I had ventured into unknown territory. Josh, with his thoughtful gaze, spoke first. "Mom, we appreciate everything you've done for us. We're here because you let us be ourselves, and if charging rent is part of that, then we accept it as a part of our growth." Lena, always the more intuitive one, added, "It's funny you mention this because I was worried it was our responsibility to take care of you, not the other way around." Their words, laden with sincerity, left me both relieved and bewildered. Here I was, thinking I was the one responsible for their future, yet together, we had created something profound, a partnership built on mutual respect and support. The subsequent weeks held a newfound sense of openness. The pressure lifted, replaced by unexpected lightness. We spoke often, delving into deeper conversations about financial stability, career aspirations, and dreams yet to be realized. Each discussion became a building block, forming a bridge between my worries and their understanding of adulthood, and suddenly, Josh and Lena were no longer just my children, but partners in a shared journey of life. As we moved further into this phase of our lives, I began to find joy in the small victories, the little projects that each of them undertook that ventured into adulthood's daunting reality, with me as a spectator cheering them on in the background. One evening, each of them sat next to me, Josh back from a successful project pitch, Lena having submitted her first freelance article, the air thick with accomplishment. I placed my hand on theirs, a silent acknowledgement of our collective achievements, a bond that transcended the need for rent or adulting responsibilities. They were soaring, and I realized I was simply here to help them acclimate to the winds beneath their wings. And so our story evolved, settling into a rhythm that felt genuine and nurturing. It was about more than money or bills, it was about lessons learned under our roof, and I cherished the thought that perhaps I hadn't been the asshole after all. It was merely the ebb and flow of family dynamics shifting. With nights spent under the gentle glow of lamplight discussing prospects and dreams, I understood that being together, sharing our fears and aspirations, had emboldened us, allowing for a new understanding about what it means to navigate adulthood together. As we moved further into this unknown future, I embraced it. The unknown no longer felt like a weight but a canvas awaiting our colors. Perhaps being a parent is knowing when to let the reins go, and I felt ready for whatever paths lay ahead. The uncertainty didn't haunt me anymore, it ignited a sense of adventure. So, maybe in this journey, I was never an asshole, but rather just a guide, and we were collectively painting a beautiful masterpiece of our shared lives. It started with a mundane moment in our living room, me scrolling through my phone while my husband, Lucas, slumped into the couch, engrossed in a video game that he was utterly convinced was the best thing since sliced bread. The air buzzed with the sounds of gunfire and explosions while I obediently pretended to laugh at the banter with his online friends despite feeling an unsettling knot growing in my stomach. We'd been married for 3 years, and while I cherished our relationship, I constantly battled with the memories of what I had left behind when I'd moved to this small town to build a life with him. The friends I had slowly slipped away, and as a result, my social calendar had dwindled to much less than I would have hoped for. So, when I received the invitation that I knew he would despise, an opportunity bloomed inside me like a flower in the desolate landscape of our evenings. It was from my college friend, Mia, who had just moved back to town and was hosting a small get-together for everyone. Mia thrived in social settings, drawing people in like moths to a flame, while Lucas preferred his solitude, avoiding social interactions like a bear dodging the hunter. I wrestled with the ethical side of my decision all day, but each time I imagined how much I missed seeing familiar faces and sharing laughter, I put down the guilt and picked up the thrill of acceptance. I typed a quick response to Mia, accepting the invitation for both of us before I could think it through entirely. The day of the gathering arrived, and the very moment I mentioned it to Lucas, expecting a mild protest at worst, I was met with incredulity. His face morphed from confusion to disbelief, and he wordlessly stared at me as though I had grown a second head. "You invited me to a party? I don't want to go," he said flatly, his voice steady but the tension unmistakable. I felt the heat of his disappointment. Still, I couldn't bring myself to apologize for something that, in my mind, was necessary. "It'll be fun," was all I managed to say, hoping to sound convincing. His muted reply stung, but I reasoned if he could join in the effort, maybe he would learn to enjoy it, and we could reconnect with some of the people who made my past feel vibrant. But as the evening approached and the prospect of the gathering loomed, I could sense his resistance tightening like a noose around my chest. As we drove to Mia's place, the silence between us felt oppressive. Lucas gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles almost white against the leather, while I attempted conversation after conversation, each met with curt replies or muttered affirmations that fell flat. Reaching Mia's house unleashed an abundance of laughter and warmth, an intoxicating air that enveloped me the moment I stepped inside, but it was clear Lucas felt anything but welcoming. I introduced him to everyone, jubilantly urging him to loosen up, to mingle, but the feeling of his reluctance followed us like a shadow. Moments turned into an unrelenting ebb of discomfort as I found joy in reconnecting with old friends while he lingered at the edges, the distant figure who carried an invisible wall. I pulled away to check on him periodically, but his responses became fewer, shorter, almost strained. By the time the clock struck mid-evening, the festive mood turned sour under the weight of an unspoken animosity. Lucas had remained isolated, the distance muting the laughter and the cocktails swirling around me. My heart sank each time I caught a glimpse of his expression, somewhere between hurt and annoyance, and in that moment, I realized I had prioritized my desire for connection over his comfort. The party blurred into the background, and my resolve to stay strong began to quiver. Finally, as Mia initiated a group game that required partners, I looked at Lucas, who did his best to smile through clenched teeth but didn't move an inch. As the laughter erupted around me, I missed the sparkle of life in his eyes, and guilt washed over me as I felt trapped by my own choices. I wished desperately to turn back time, to have that moment at home again where I could have refused Mia's invitation from the start, protecting both my husband and myself from this brewing discord. With a heavy heart, I made my way back to Lucas, the laughter drowning in the realization that I could pull him back, but devoid of the spark that had brought me here. He was slipping away. "Can we leave?" he asked quietly, and my heart twisted painfully as relief finally washed over me. "Of course," I replied, the tension easing as I felt a mutual understanding wrap around us like a thin, tawdry blanket. We slid out of the warm embrace of the house, leaving behind echoes of laughter and familiar faces, heading home where I vowed to make amends. In the following days, the silence was laden with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Eventually, we found ourselves in that same living room again, this time under a calm atmosphere, the sun setting peacefully outside as we sat down together, his eyes meeting mine. I laid it bare, the guilt and the desire for understanding. To my surprise, Lucas shared his feelings too, expressing that my actions, while not malicious, had cast him aside in a moment critical to my rediscovery. It was an eye-opener for both of us, becoming a defining moment where we learned the importance of communication and the necessity of being both partners and friends. In hindsight, I understood I must never take liberties on his behalf again, and he recognized that while solace could be sought in our shared moments, it wouldn't always be his preferred silence. As I reflect on our story, I can't shake the feeling that we grew stronger that day. The tension that once lingered became a stepping stone for a deeper understanding. We laughed at the irony that tied our lives, realizing we were indeed partners in a balancing act of friendship against the backdrop of love. I share this now in hopes of letting others see the importance of clarity and connection in relationships, learning to stand side by side instead of drifting apart into uncertainty. And just when I thought it was the end, Mia started planning a redemption gathering, this time with the option to bring a partner. Consider our invitation for both of us a rather thoughtful approach that respects boundaries while still allowing for growth and connection. Ah, the irony and beauty of relationships. Perhaps the silver lining was that out of miscommunication, we discovered a deepened bond. As I gazed at the invitation clutched between my fingers, a soft breeze wafted through the open window, carrying with it the scent of early spring flowers blooming outside. It felt strange, looking over the neatly penned names and the proposed date that loomed on the horizon. The redemption gathering, as Mia had labeled it, presented a fresh opportunity that was both exciting and nerve-wracking. Reflecting on the past months following that heated argument with my husband, Alex, I found myself in a space that was surprisingly contemplative. The first gathering had been a disaster, awkward silences, forced laughter, and the sense that I had dragged Alex into something he genuinely disliked. The more I thought about it, the more guilt weighed heavily on my heart. Yet, that challenging experience seemed to have nudged us in the right direction. We had talked more openly since then, sharing our thoughts on expectations, personal boundaries, and what we truly wanted from our relationships, both with each other and with others. Still, the prospect of attending this new gathering brought back a flicker of anxiety. What if things went sideways again? What if Alex withdrew into himself, refusing to engage? The mere thought made me slightly nauseous, but I also had found that these moments of discomfort often led to the most profound growth. That evening, as the sky transitioned to a soothing shade of deep blue, I mustered the courage to broach the subject with him. Sitting across from Alex at our small kitchen table, I watched the light from the overhead fixture cast gentle shadows on his face. His brow furrowed as I laid out the details. "Can we talk about Mia's gathering?" I started, my voice steady but my heart racing. "She's decided to have a second one, and this time, it's open to partners." Alex lifted his gaze from the fork he was idly spinning. I could see the flicker of interest behind his eyes, though a shadow of tension clung to the corners of his mouth. "Are you serious? You think we should go?" "I mean," I thought. I paused, uncertain how to phrase my thoughts without triggering any defensiveness. I thought it could be a chance to try again, to connect with people outside our usual circle. We wouldn't have to force anything, we could just see how it goes. He leaned back in his chair, a mix of contemplation and reluctance etching his features. "You remember how the last one went, don't you?" I felt so out of place. The music was too loud, and the conversations felt superficial. "I do," I said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "But we've had some time since then. I think we've both grown a bit. Plus, maybe we could come up with a plan together to make it more enjoyable for you. You can be involved with the choices this time." His gaze softened at my words, and for a moment, I could see the wheels turning in his mind. "All right," he finally replied, the corners of his mouth curling into a faint smile. "But only if I get to pick some activities. No more impromptu let's play this game situations." "Deal," I said, relief flooding through me as I squeezed his hand. We spent the next hour discussing how we could approach the evening. We mapped out an escape plan, should he begin to feel overwhelmed, and even decided on what appetizer we might bring, something simple yet comforting. The more we planned, the lighter the tension in the air became. I realized how transcendent it could be to share such moments of vulnerability. The day of the gathering arrived, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with strokes of orange and violet, I felt an unexpected thrill run through me. The gathering itself unfolded more smoothly than I could have imagined. While there were moments when Alex would excuse himself to drink water or step outside for a breath of fresh air, he surprised me by interspersing these breaks with laughter and engaging conversations. It was as if he had stepped into an entirely new persona, comfortable yet refreshingly authentic. After the flow of conversation and refreshments waned, Mia decided to initiate an impromptu game. I could feel Alex tense momentarily, but instead of retreating back into his shell, he whispered to me, "Let's make it our own." And we did just that, molding the game to fit our comfort level. Laughter echoed around the room, and rather than feeling like spectators, Alex and I became participants crafting our moments together. At the end of the night, as we drove home, I glanced over at him, captivated by the peaceful expression on his face. "I'm glad we went," he said softly. "I didn't expect to have that much fun." As we settled into the quiet of our shared space, the tension that had once festered in the corners of our relationship began to dissolve. In those moments, I realized that vulnerability isn't just about sharing our fears and insecurities, it's about stepping forward into the unknown together, hand in hand. As the days passed, the memories of the gathering lingered, like a gentle reminder against the backdrop of our life together. Alex and I continued to communicate more, feeling our way through shared experiences, carving out areas where we could meet in the middle. The bond we forged grew deeper with each conversation, every shared smile, and even the silences no longer felt heavy, but rather embraced the soothing rhythm of companionship. And while I still sometimes replayed the moments of uncertainty in my mind, the invitations I accepted on his behalf, the guilt I had struggled with, it became evident that those choices, fraught with anxiety at the time, were stepping stones leading us into a future enriched by connection and understanding. With that in mind, I wrote a quick update to this story, unsure of how many might resonate with our experience but hopeful that it might provide a glimmer of peace for others. It might seem trivial, the little triumphs we achieve through discomfort, but in the grand tapestry of love and relationships, those moments are what fill the edges with color. In the end, it wasn't simply about whether or not I was the asshole for inviting Alex without his consent. It was a journey reflecting the beautiful complexity of partnership, each misstep becoming an opportunity for growth, each reluctance morphing into newfound strength. Together, we explored the intricate dance of acceptance and trust, our love flourishing amid the chaos. Sometimes, that's exactly what a relationship needs, a little risk, a little vulnerability, and a whole lot of love. As Mia's redemption gathering drew closer, my heart danced with anticipation, caught somewhere between excitement and nerves. I found myself daydreaming about what this gathering would entail, a cozy evening filled with laughter, warmth, and the reassuring hum of conversations weaving through the air like an old, familiar song. It was a promise of new beginnings, a chance to mend what had frayed and bring Alex and me closer to not only Mia but to the people who may have misinterpreted our earlier miscommunication. In the weeks leading up to the event, Alex and I delved into the depths of our partnership, discussing our feelings and expectations, both on a personal level and regarding our relationships with others. I was struck by the realization that communication, though often challenging, was a powerful tool we could wield together. We shared late nights filled with whispered confessions, laughter echoing into the dark, and moments of shared silence that spoke volumes more than words ever could. It wasn't easy, but as we navigated this terrain, I felt an unwavering sense of connection growing, blossoming amidst our conversations. The night of the gathering arrived with a crispness in the air, a soft embrace of autumn welcoming us at Mia's doorstep. She had transformed her living room into a comforting haven, with soft string lights casting a warm glow over the assembled group. Instantly, the atmosphere felt alive, buzzing with shared energy and the promise of heartfelt interaction. I looked at Alex, who stood beside me, his expression a careful blend of curiosity and cautious optimism. As we walked through the door together, I felt the weighted ties of my earlier mistake lifting, replaced by the buoyant possibilities of a shared experience. Mia greeted us with open arms, her smile a bright beacon amid the gathering crowd. The moment we stepped into that room, I realized how surrounded we were by friends who genuinely cared about our happiness, people who understood the complexity of relationships and were there not to judge but to embrace the beautifully messy journey we all traveled. As introductions floated around the room, I noticed Alex relaxing, allowing himself to be drawn into conversations, laughter bubbling forth as we mingled with others who had experienced feelings of alienation fully. We shared stories about misunderstandings and unexpected turnarounds, forming connections between kindred spirits navigating similar paths. The more I watched him engage with others, the more my heart swelled with love and appreciation for how far we had come. It was in this environment of acceptance that we began to open up further to one another, Alex sharing his initial apprehensions about the gathering, revealing how caught off guard he had felt when I accepted the invitation without discussing it with him first. The honesty in his voice was disarming, but I also recognized a hint of admiration, a testament to the connection we were fostering. Later in the evening, Mia gathered everyone around for a moment of reflection, inviting us to share something meaningful we'd learned about ourselves in recent times. As we went around the circle, I noticed the vulnerability threading through our words, with each story of miscommunication and growth echoing the themes of understanding and acceptance. When it was my turn, I spoke of the lesson I learned through this experience, emphasizing the importance of consent and the value of surprises wrapped in consideration. I could see Alex's eyes widening slightly in surprise, and at that moment, it struck me, together, we had crafted something beautiful from the raw edges of our previous missteps. As the night wore on, a gentle mix of nostalgia and hope enveloped me, and I felt an overwhelming gratitude for the way life unfurled itself before us like a tapestry continuously being woven. I realized that relationships are not dictated by the occasional blunders but are reinforced by our willingness to learn and grow through each encounter. Perhaps, in the grand scheme of love and partnerships, our moments of uncertainty were just stepping stones leading us toward greater intimacy and understanding. Later that night, we found ourselves heading home, the streets illuminated by the soft glow of street lamps. The silence between us felt comfortable. It was filled with understanding, shared smiles, and the occasional laugh as we recounted comical exchanges from the gathering. The past few weeks resonated within me as I took Alex's hand, understanding that our connection had woven a safety net beneath us, cushioning us from the chaos of life's little storms. The curious beauty of relationships was revealed, a mosaic crafted not merely from harmonious moments but from painful lessons, fractured expectations, laughter, and love, that weave into something extraordinary when nurtured tenderly over time. And as we settled into our evening routine, I felt lighter, the shadows of doubt fading far into the background. I realized that I wouldn't change a thing about our experience, miscommunication included. It simply added depth to our journey, breathing life into our bond. I knew then that we'd constantly be evolving, finding new ways to express our love and support for one another, always navigating together, ever so intricately, through the beautiful tapestry of our lives. The air hummed with the promise of tomorrow, and as I turned to sleep, I felt an exciting tranquility flow through me, offering ripe possibilities like a still river waiting to be explored.